Studies in Occultism. By P Blavatsky. Practical Occultism. Important to students. As some of the letters in the correspondence of this month show, there are many people who are looking for practical instruction in occultism. It becomes necessary, therefore, to state once for all a. The essential difference between theoretical and practical occultism, or what is generally known as theosophy on the one hand, and occult science on the other, and b. The nature of the difficulties involved in the study of the latter. It is easy to become a theosophist. Any person of average intellectual capacities, and a leaning toward the metaphysical, of pure, unselfish life, who finds more joy in helping his neighbor than in receiving help himself. One who is ever ready to sacrifice his own pleasures for the sake of other people, and who loves truth, goodness and wisdom for their own sake, not for the benefit they may confer, is a theosophist. But it is quite another matter to put oneself upon the path which leads to the knowledge of what is good to do, as to the right discrimination of good from evil. A path which also leads a man to that power through which he can do the good he desires, often without even apparently lifting a finger. Moreover, there is one important fact with which the student should be made acquainted. Namely, the enormous, almost limitless, responsibility assumed by the teacher for the sake of the pupil. From the gurus of the East who teach openly or secretly, down to the few Kabbalists in Western lands who undertake to teach the rudiments of the sacred science to their disciples, those Western hierophants being often themselves ignorant of the danger they incur, one and all of these teachers are subject to the same inviolable law. From the moment they begin really to teach, from the instant they confer any power, whether psychic, mental or physical, on their pupils, they take upon themselves all the sins of that pupil, in connection with the occult sciences. Whether of omission or commission, until the moment when initiation makes the pupil a master and responsible in his turn. There is a weird and mystic religious law, greatly reverenced and acted upon in the Greek, half forgotten in the Roman Catholic, and absolutely extinct in the Protestant Church. It dates from the earliest days of Christianity and has its basis in the law just stated, of which it was a symbol and an expression. This is the dogma of the absolute sacredness of the relation between the godparents who stand sponsors for a child. These tacitly take upon themselves all the sins of the newly baptized child, anointed, as at the initiation, a mystery truly. Until the day when the child becomes a responsible unit, knowing good and evil. Thus it is clear why the teachers are so reticent, and why chellists are required to serve a 7 years probation to prove their fitness, and develop the qualities necessary to the security of both master and pupil. Occultism is not magic. It is comparatively easy to learn the trick of spells and the methods of using the subtler, but still material, forces of physical nature. The powers of the animal soul in man are soon awakened. The forces which his love, his hate, his passion, can call into operation, are readily developed. But this is black magic, sorcery. For it is the motive, and the motive alone, which makes any exercise of power become black, malignant, or white, beneficent magic. It is impossible to employ spiritual forces if there is the slightest tinge of selfishness remaining in the operator. For, unless the intention is entirely unalloyed, the spiritual will transform itself into the psychic, act on the astral plane, and dire results may be produced by it. The powers and forces of animal nature can equally be used by the selfish and revengeful, as by the unselfish and the all-forgiving. The powers and forces of spirit lend themselves only to the perfectly pure in heart, and this is divine magic. What are then the conditions required to become a student of the divine sapientia? For let it be known that no such instruction can possibly be given unless these certain conditions are complied with, and rigorously carried out during the years of study. This is a sine qua non. No man can swim unless he enters deep water. No bird can fly unless its wings are grown, and it has space before it and courage to trust itself to the air. A man who will wield a two-edged sword, must be a thorough master of the blunt weapon, if he would not injure himself, or what is worse, others, at the first attempt. To give an approximate idea of the conditions under which alone the study of divine wisdom can be pursued with safety, that is without danger that divine will give place to black magic, a page is given from the private rules, with which every instructor in the East is furnished. The few passages which follow are chosen from a great number and explained in brackets. 1. The place selected for receiving instruction must be a spot calculated not to distract the mind, and filled with influence-evolving, magnetic, objects. The 5 sacred colors gathered in a circle must be there among other things. The place must be free from any malignant influences hanging about in the air. The place must be set apart, and used for no other purpose. The 5 sacred colors are the prismatic hues arranged in a certain way, as these colors are very magnetic. By malignant influences are meant any disturbances through strife, quarrels, bad feelings, etc. As these are said to impress themselves immediately on the astral light, i.e., in the atmosphere of the place, and to hang about in the air. This first condition seems easy enough to accomplish, yet, on further consideration, it is one of the most difficult ones to obtain. 2. Before the disciple shall be permitted to study face to face, he has to acquire preliminary understanding in a select company of other lay upasaka, disciples, the number of whom must be odd. Face to face means in this instance a study independent or apart from others, when the disciple gets his instruction face to face either with himself, his higher, divine self, or his guru. It is then only that each receives his due of information, according to the use he has made of his knowledge. This can happen only toward the end of the cycle of instruction. 3. Before thou, the teacher, shalt impart to thy Lanu, disciple, the good, holy, words of Lamrim, or shall permit him to make ready for Dubjad, thou shalt take care that his mind is thoroughly purified and at peace with all, especially with his other selves. Otherwise the words of wisdom and of the good law shall scatter and be picked up by the winds. Lamrim is a work of practical instructions, by Tsongkhapa, in 2 portions, one for ecclesiastical and exoteric purposes, the other for esoteric use. To make ready for Dubjad is to prepare the vessels used for seership, such as mirrors and crystals. The other selves refers to the fellow students. Unless the greatest harmony reigns among the learners, no success is possible. It is the teacher who makes the selections according to the magnetic and electric natures of the students, bringing together and adjusting most carefully the positive and the negative elements. 4. The upasaka while studying must take care to be united as the fingers on one hand. Thou shalt impress upon their minds that whatever hurts one should hurt the others, and if the rejoicing of one finds no echo in the breasts of the others, then the required conditions are absent, and it is useless to proceed. This can hardly happen if the preliminary choice made was consistent with the magnetic requirements. It is known that chelists otherwise promising and fit for the reception of truth, had to wait for years on account of their temper and the impossibility they felt to put themselves in tune with their companions. 5. The co-disciples must be tuned by the guru as the strings of a lute, veena, each different from the others, yet each emitting sounds in harmony with all. Collectively they must form a keyboard answering in all its parts to thy lightest touch, the touch of the Master. Thus their minds shall open for the harmonies of wisdom, to vibrate as knowledge through each and all, resulting in effects pleasing to the presiding gods, tutelary or patron angels, and useful to the Lanu. So shall wisdom be impressed forever on their hearts and the harmony of the law shall never be broken. 6. Those who desire to acquire the knowledge leading to the cities, occult powers, have to renounce all the vanities of life and of the world. Here follows enumeration of the cities. 7. None can feel the difference between himself and his fellow students, such as, I am the wisest, I am more holy and pleasing to the teacher, or in my community, than my brother, etc., and remain in upasaka. His thoughts must be predominantly fixed upon his heart, chasing therefrom every hostile thought to any living being. The heart, must be full of the feeling of its non-separateness from the rest of beings as from all in nature. Otherwise no success can follow. 8. A Lanu, disciple, has to dread external living influence alone, magnetic emanations from living creatures. For this reason, while at one with all, in his inner nature, he must take care to separate his outer, external, body from every foreign influence. None must drink out of, or eat in his cup but himself. He must avoid bodily contact, i.e., being touched or touch, with human, as with animal being. No pet animals are permitted, and it is forbidden even to touch certain trees and plants. A disciple has to live, so to say, in his own atmosphere in order to individualize it for occult purposes. 9. The mind must remain blunt to all but the universal truths in nature, lest the doctrine of the heart should become only the doctrine of the eye, i.e., empty esoteric ritualism. 10. No animal food of whatever kind, nothing that has life in it, should be taken by the disciple. No wine, no spirits, or opium should be used, for these are like the Lamaean, evil spirits, who fasten upon the unwary, they devour the understanding. Wine and spirits are supposed to contain and preserve the bad magnetism of all the men who helped in their fabrication, the meat of each animal, to preserve the psychic characteristics of its kind. 11. Meditation, abstinence in all, the observation of moral duties, gentle thoughts, good deeds and kind words, as goodwill to all and entire oblivion of self, are the most efficacious means of obtaining knowledge and preparing for the reception of higher wisdom. 12. It is only by virtue of a strict observance of the foregoing rules that a Lanu can hope to acquire in good time the cities of the Arhats, the growth which makes him become gradually one with the universal all. These 12 extracts are taken from amongst some 73 rules, to enumerate which would be useless, as they would be meaningless in Europe. But even these few are enough to show the immensity of the difficulties which beset the path of the would-be Upasaka, who has been born and bred in Western lands. 2. All Western, and especially English, education is instinct with the principle of emulation and strife. Each boy is urged to learn more quickly, to outstrip his companions, and to surpass them in every possible way. What is miscalled friendly rivalry is assiduously cultivated, and the same spirit is fostered and strengthened in every detail of life. With such ideas educated into him from his childhood, how can a Westerner bring himself to feel towards his co-students as the fingers on one hand? Those co-students, too, are not of his own selection, or chosen by himself from personal sympathy and appreciation. They are chosen by his teacher on far other grounds, and he who would be a student must first be strong enough to kill out in his heart all feelings of dislike and antipathy to others. How many Westerners are ready even to attempt this in earnest? And then the details of daily life, the command not to touch even the hand of one's nearest and dearest. How contrary to Western notions of affection and good feeling. How cold and hard it seems. Egotistical too, people would say, to abstain from giving pleasure to others for the sake of one's own development. Well, let those who think so defer, till another lifetime, the attempt to enter the path in real earnest. But let them not glory in their own fancied unselfishness. For, in reality, it is only the seeming appearances which they allow to deceive them, the conventional notions, based on emotionalism and gush, or so-called courtesy, things of the unreal life, not the dictates of truth. But even putting aside these difficulties, which may be considered external, though their importance is none the less great, how are students in the West to attune themselves to harmony as here required of them? So strong has personality grown in Europe and America, that there is no school of artists even whose members do not hate and are not jealous of each other. Professional hatred and envy have become proverbial. Men seek each to benefit himself at all costs, and even the so-called courtesies of life are but a hollow mask covering these demons of hatred and jealousy. In the East the spirit of non-separateness is inculcated as steadily from childhood up, as in the West the spirit of rivalry. Personal ambition, personal feelings and desires, are not encouraged to grow so rampant there. When the soil is naturally good, it is cultivated in the right way, and the child grows into a man in whom the habit of subordination of one's lower to one's higher self is strong and powerful. In the West, men think that their own likes and dislikes of other men and things are guiding principles for them to act upon, even when they do not make of them the law of their lives and seek to impose them upon others. Let those who complain that they have learned little in the Theosophical Society lay to heart the words written in an article in The Path for last February: the key in each degree is the aspirant himself. It is not the fear of God, which is the beginning of wisdom, but the knowledge of self which is wisdom itself. How grand and true appears, thus, to the student of occultism who has commenced to realize some of the foregoing truths. The answer given by the Delphic oracle to all who came seeking after occult wisdom, words repeated and enforced again and again by the wise Socrates: man, know thyself. Cellaship has nothing whatever to do with means of subsistence or anything of the kind, for a man can isolate his mind entirely from his body and its surroundings. Cellaship is a state of mind, rather than a life according to hard and fast rules on the physical plane. This applies especially to the earlier, probationary period, while the rules given in Lucifer for April last pertain properly to a later stage, that of actual occult training in the development of occult powers and insight. These rules indicate, however, the mode of life which ought to be followed by all aspirants so far as practicable, since it is the most helpful to them in their aspirations. It should never be forgotten that occultism is concerned with the inner man, who must be strengthened and freed from the dominion of the physical body and its surroundings, which must become his servants. Hence the first and chief necessity of cellaship is a spirit of absolute unselfishness and devotion to truth, then follow self-knowledge and self-mastery. These are all important. While outward observance of fixed rules of life is a matter of secondary moment. P Blavatsky, Lucifer 4, 348n. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. Occultism versus the occult arts. I oft have heard, but ne'er believed till now. There are, who can by potent magic spells bend to their crooked purpose nature's laws. Milton. In this month's correspondence, several letters testify to the strong impression produced on some minds by our last month's article, Practical Occultism. Such letters go far to prove and strengthen two logical conclusions. A. There are more well-educated and thoughtful men who believe in the existence of occultism and magic, the two differing vastly, than the modern materialist dreams of. And B. That most of the believers, comprising many theosophists, have no definite idea of the nature of occultism and confuse it with the occult sciences in general, the black art included. Their representations of the powers it confers upon man, and of the means to be used to acquire them, are as varied as they are fanciful. Some imagine that a master in the art, to show the way, is all that is needed to become a Zanoni. Others, that one has but to cross the Canal of Suez and go to India to bloom forth as Roger Bacon or even a Count St. Germain. Many take for their ideal Margrave with his ever-renewing youth, and care little for the soul as the price paid for it. Not a few, mistaking witch of Enderism, pure and simple, for occultism, through the yawning earth from Stygian gloom, call up the meager ghost to walks of light, and want, on the strength of this feat, to be regarded as full-blown adepts. Ceremonial magic, according to the rules mockingly laid down by Eliphas Levi, is another imagined alter ego of the philosophy of the Arhats of old. In short, the prisms through which occultism appears, to those innocent of the philosophy, are as multicolored and varied as human fancy can make them. Will these candidates to wisdom and power feel very indignant if told the plain truth? It is not only useful, but it has now become necessary to disabuse most of them, and before it is too late. This truth may be said in a few words: there are not in the West half a dozen among the fervent hundreds who call themselves occultists, who have even an approximately correct idea of the nature of the science they seek to master. With a few exceptions, they are all on the highway to sorcery. Let them restore some order in the chaos that reigns in their minds, before they protest against this statement. Let them first learn the true relation in which the occult sciences stand to occultism, and the difference between the two, and then feel wrathful if they still think themselves right. Meanwhile, let them learn that occultism differs from magic and other secret sciences as the glorious sun does from a rushlight, as the immutable and immortal spirit of man, the reflection of the absolute, causeless and unknowable all, differs from the mortal clay, the human body. In our highly civilized West, where modern languages have been formed, and words coined, in the wake of ideas and thoughts, as happened with every tongue, the more the latter became materialized in the cold atmosphere of Western selfishness and its incessant chase after the goods of this world, the less was there any need felt for the production of new terms to express that which was tacitly regarded as absolute and exploded superstition. Such words could answer only to ideas which a cultured man was scarcely supposed to harbor in his mind. Magic, a synonym for jugglery, sorcery, an equivalent for crass ignorance, and occultism, the sorry relic of crack-brained, medieval fire philosophers, of the Jacob Boehmes and the St. Martins, are expressions believed more than amply sufficient to cover the whole field of thimble-rigging. They are terms of contempt, and used generally only in reference to the dross and residues of the Dark Ages and the preceding eons of paganism. Therefore have we no terms in the English tongue to define and shade the difference between such abnormal powers, or the sciences that lead to the acquisition of them, with the nicety possible in the Eastern languages, preeminently the Sanskrit. What do the words miracle and enchantment, words identical in meaning after all, as both express the idea of producing wonderful things by breaking the laws of nature, as explained by the accepted authorities, convey to the minds of those who hear, or pronounce them? A Christian, breaking of the laws of nature, notwithstanding, while believing firmly in the miracles, because said to have been produced by God through Moses, will either scout the enchantments performed by Pharaoh's magicians, or attribute them to the devil. It is the latter whom our pious enemies connect with occultism, while their impious foes, the infidels, laugh at Moses, magicians and occultists, and would blush to give one serious thought to such superstitions. This, because there is no term in existence to show the difference, no words to express the lights and shadows and draw the line of demarcation between the sublime and the true, the absurd and the ridiculous. The latter are the theological interpretations which teach the breaking of the laws of nature, by man, God, or devil. The former, the scientific miracles and enchantments of Moses and the magicians in accordance with natural laws, both having been learned in all the wisdom of the sanctuaries, which were the royal societies of those days, and in true occultism. This last word is certainly misleading, translated as it stands from the compound word guptavidya, secret knowledge. But the knowledge of what? Some of the Sanskrit terms may help us. There are 4, out of the many others, names of the various kinds of esoteric knowledge or sciences given, even in the exoteric Puranas. There is, 1. Yajnavidya, 3. Knowledge of the occult powers awakened in nature by the performance of certain religious ceremonies and rites. 2. Mahavidya, the great knowledge, the magic of the Kabbalists and the Tantrika worship, often sorcery of the worst description. 3. Guhyavidya, knowledge of the mystic powers residing in sound, ether, hence in the mantras, chanted prayers or incantations, and depending on the rhythm and melody used. In other words, a magical performance based on knowledge of the forces of nature and their correlation, and, for Atmavidya, a term which is translated simply knowledge of the soul, true wisdom by the Orientalists, but which means far more. This last is the only kind of occultism that any theosophist who admires light on the path, and who would be wise and unselfish, ought to strive after. All the rest is some branch of the occult sciences, i.e., arts based on the knowledge of the ultimate essence of all things in the kingdoms of nature, such as minerals, plants and animals, hence of things pertaining to the realm of material nature, however invisible that essence may be, and howsoever much it has hitherto eluded the grasp of science. Alchemy, astrology, occult physiology, chiromancy, exist in nature, and the exact sciences, perhaps so called, because they are found in this age of paradoxical philosophies, the reverse, have already discovered not a few of the secrets of the above arts. But clairvoyance, symbolized in India as the eye of Shiva, called in Japan, infinite vision, is not hypnotism, the illegitimate son of mesmerism, and is not to be acquired by such arts. All the others may be mastered and results obtained, whether good, bad, or indifferent, but Atmavidya sets small value on them. It includes them all and may even use them occasionally, but it does so after purifying them of their dross, for beneficent purposes, and taking care to deprive them of every element of selfish motive. Let us explain. Any man or woman can set himself or herself to study one or all of the above specified occult arts, without any great previous preparation, and even without adopting any too restraining mode of life. One could even dispense with any lofty standard of morality. In the last case, of course, 10 to 1 the student would blossom into a very decent kind of sorcerer, and tumble down headlong into black magic. But what can this matter? The voodoos and dugpa eat, drink and are merry over hecatombs of victims of their infernal arts. And so do the amiable gentlemen vivisectionists and the diplomaed hypnotizers of the faculties of medicine. The only difference between the two classes being that the voodoos and dugpa are conscious, and the charcatrichet crew unconscious, sorcerers. Thus, since both have to reap the fruits of their labors and achievements in the black art, the Western practitioners should not have the punishment and reputation without the profits and enjoyments they may get therefrom. For we say it again, hypnotism and vivisection as practiced in such schools, are sorcery pure and simple, minus a knowledge that the voodoos and dugpa enjoy, and which no charcatrichet can procure for himself in 50 years of hard study and experimental observation. Let then those who will dabble in magic, whether they understand its nature or not, but who find the rules imposed upon students too hard, and who, therefore, lay Atmavidya or occultism aside, go without it. Let them become magicians by all means, even though they do become voodoos and dugpa for the next 10 incarnations. But the interest of our readers will probably center on those who are invincibly attracted towards the occult, yet who neither realize the true nature of what they aspire towards, nor have they become passion-proof, far less truly unselfish. How about these unfortunates, we shall be asked, who are thus rent in twain by conflicting forces? For it has been said too often to need repetition, and the fact itself is patent to any observer, that when once the desire for occultism has really awakened in a man's heart, there remains for him no hope of peace. No place of rest and comfort in all the world. He is driven out into the wild and desolate spaces of life by an ever-gnawing unrest he cannot quell. His heart is too full of passion and selfish desire to permit him to pass the golden gate. He cannot find rest or peace in ordinary life. Must he then inevitably fall into sorcery and black magic, and through many incarnations heap up for himself a terrible karma? Is there no other road for him? Indeed there is, we answer. Let him aspire to no higher than he feels able to accomplish. Let him not take a burden upon himself too heavy for him to carry. Without ever becoming a Mahatma, a Buddha or a great saint, let him study the philosophy and the science of the soul, and he can become one of the modest benefactors of humanity, without any superhuman powers. Siddhis, or the Arhat powers, are only for those who are able to lead the life, to comply with the terrible sacrifices required for such a training, and to comply with them to the very letter. Let them know at once and remember always, that true occultism or theosophy is the great renunciation of self, unconditionally and absolutely, in thought as in action. It is altrusm, and it throws him who practices it out of calculation of the ranks of the living altogether. Not for himself, but for the world, he lives, as soon as he has pledged himself to the work. Much is forgiven during the first years of probation. But, no sooner is he accepted than his personality must disappear, and he has to become a mere beneficent force in nature. There are 2 poles for him after that, 2 paths, and no midward place of rest. He has either to ascend laboriously, step by step, often through numerous incarnations and no devachanic break, the golden ladder leading to Mahatmaship, the Arhat or Bodhisattva condition. Or, he will let himself slide down the ladder at the first false step, and roll down into Dugpaship. All this is either unknown or left out of sight altogether. Indeed, one who is able to follow the silent evolution of the preliminary aspirations of the candidates, often finds strange ideas quietly taking possession of their minds. There are those whose reasoning powers have been so distorted by foreign influences that they imagine that animal passions can be so sublimated and elevated that their fury, force, and fire can, so to speak, be turned inwards. That they can be stored and shut up in one's breast, until their energy is, not expended, but turned toward higher and more holy purposes, namely, until their collective and unexpended strength enables their possessor to enter the true sanctuary of the soul and stand therein in the presence of the Master, the higher self. For this purpose they will not struggle with their passions nor slay them. They will simply, by a strong effort of will, put down the fierce flames and keep them at bay within their natures, allowing the fire to smolder under a thin layer of ashes. They submit joyfully to the torture of the Spartan boy who allowed the fox to devour his entrails rather than part with it. Oh, poor blind visionaries! As well hope that a band of drunken chimney sweeps, hot and greasy from their work, may be shut up in a sanctuary hung with pure white linen, and that instead of soiling and turning it by their presence into a heap of dirty shreds, they will become masters in and of the sacred recess, and finally emerge from it as immaculate as that recess. Why not imagine that a dozen of skunks imprisoned in the pure atmosphere of a Gonpa, a monastery, can issue out of it impregnated with all the perfumes of the incenses used, strange aberration of the human mind. Can it be so? Let us argue. The Master in the sanctuary of our souls is the higher self, the divine spirit whose consciousness is based upon and derived solely, at any rate during the mortal life of the man in whom it is captive, from the mind, which we have agreed to call the human soul, the spiritual soul, being the vehicle of the spirit. In its turn the former, the personal or human soul, is a compound in its highest form, of spiritual aspirations, volitions, and divine love. And in its lower aspects, of animal desires and terrestrial passions imparted to it by its associations with its vehicle, the seat of all these. It thus stands as a link and a medium between the animal nature of man which its higher reason seeks to subdue, and his divine spiritual nature to which it gravitates, whenever it has the upper hand in its struggle with the inner animal. The latter is the instinctual, animal soul, and is the hotbed of those passions, which, as just shown, are lulled instead of being killed, and locked up in their breasts by some imprudent enthusiasts. Do they still hope to turn thereby the muddy stream of the animal sewer into the crystalline waters of life? And where, on what neutral ground can they be imprisoned so as not to affect man? The fierce passions of love and lust are still alive and they are allowed to still remain in the place of their birth, that same animal soul. For both the higher and the lower portions of the human soul or mind reject such inmates, though they cannot avoid being tainted with them as neighbors. The higher self or spirit is as unable to assimilate such feelings as water to get mixed with oil or unclean liquid tallow. It is thus the mind alone, the sole link and medium between the man of earth and the higher self, that is the only sufferer, and which is in the incessant danger of being dragged down by those passions that may be reawakened at any moment, and perish in the abyss of matter. And how can it ever attune itself to the divine harmony of the highest principle, when that harmony is destroyed by the mere presence, within the sanctuary in preparation, of such animal passions? How can harmony prevail and conquer, when the soul is stained and distracted with the turmoil of passions and the terrestrial desires of the bodily senses, or even of the astral man? For this astral, the shadowy double, in the animal as in man, is not the companion of the divine ego but of the earthly body. It is the link between the personal self, the lower consciousness of Manas and the body, and is the vehicle of transitory, not of immortal life. Like the shadow projected by man, it follows the movements and impulses slavishly and mechanically, and leans therefore to matter without ever ascending to spirit. It is only when the power of the passions is dead altogether, and when they have been crushed and annihilated in the retort of an unflinching will. When not only all the lusts and longings of the flesh are dead, but also the recognition of the personal self is killed out and the astral has been reduced in consequence to a cipher, that the union with the higher self can take place. Then when the astral reflects only the conquered man, the still living but no more the longing, selfish personality, then the brilliant ogoids, the divine self, can vibrate in conscious harmony with both the poles of the human entity, the man of matter purified, and the ever-pure spiritual soul, and stand in the presence of the master self, the Christos of the mystic Gnostic, blended, merged into, and one with it forever. 4. How then can it be thought possible for a man to enter the straight gate of occultism when his daily and hourly thoughts are bound up with worldly things, desires of possession and power, with lust, ambition and duties, which, however honorable, are still of the earthy? Even the love of wife and family, the purest as the most unselfish of human affections, is a barrier to real occultism. For whether we take as an example the holy love of a mother for her child, or that of a husband for his wife, even in these feelings, when analyzed to the very bottom, and thoroughly sifted, there is still selfishness in the first, and an egoism ado in the second instance. What mother would not sacrifice without a moment's hesitation hundreds and thousands of lives for that of the child of her heart? And what lover or true husband would not break the happiness of every other man and woman around him to satisfy the desire of one whom he loves? This is but natural, we shall be told. Quite so, in the light of the code of human affections. Less so, in that of divine universal love. For, while the heart is full of thoughts for a little group of selves, near and dear to us, how shall the rest of mankind fare in our souls? What percentage of love and care will there remain to bestow on the great orphan? And how shall the still small voice make itself heard in a soul entirely occupied with its own privileged tenets? What room is there left for the seeds of humanity en bloc to impress themselves upon, or even receive a speedy response? And yet, he who would profit by the wisdom of the universal mind, has to reach it through the whole of humanity without distinction of race, complexion, religion or social status. It is altruism, not egoism even in its most legal and noble conception, that can lead the unit to merge its little self in the universal selves. It is to these needs and to this work that the true disciple of occultism has to devote himself, if he would obtain theosophy, divine wisdom and knowledge. The aspirant has to choose absolutely between the life of the world and the life of occultism. It is useless and vain to endeavor to unite the two, for no one can serve two masters and satisfy both. No one can serve his body and the higher soul, and do his family duty and his universal duty, without depriving either one or the other of its rights. For he will either lend his ear to the still small voice and fail to hear the cries of his little ones, or he will listen but to the wants of the latter and remain deaf to the voice of humanity. It would be a ceaseless, a maddening struggle for almost any married man, who would pursue true practical occultism, instead of its theoretical philosophy. For he would find himself ever hesitating between the voice of the impersonal divine love of humanity, and that of the personal, terrestrial love. And this could only lead him to fail in one or the other, or perhaps in both his duties. Worse than this. For, whoever indulges after having pledged himself to occultism in the gratification of a terrestrial love or lust, must feel an almost immediate result. That of being irresistibly dragged from the impersonal divine state down to the lower plane of matter. Sensual, even mental self-gratification, involves the immediate loss of the powers of spiritual discernment. The voice of the master can no longer be distinguished from that of one's passions or even that of a dogma, the right from wrong, sound morality from mere casuistry. The Dead Sea fruit assumes the most glorious mystic appearance, only to turn to ashes on their lips, and to gall in the heart resulting in depth ever deepening, darkness darkening still. Folly for wisdom, guilt for innocence. Anguish for rapture, and for hope despair. And once being mistaken and having acted on their mistakes, most men shrink from realizing their error, and thus descend deeper and deeper into the mire. And, although it is the intention that decides primarily whether white or black magic is exercised, yet the results even of involuntary, unconscious sorcery cannot fail to be productive of bad karma. Enough has been said to show that sorcery is any kind of evil influence exercised upon other persons, who suffer, or make other persons to suffer, in consequence. Karma is a heavy stone splashed in the quiet waters of life. And it must produce ever-widening circles of ripples, carried wider and wider, almost ad infinitum. Such causes produced have to call forth effects, and these are evidenced in the just laws of retribution. Much of this may be avoided if people will only abstain from rushing into practices neither the nature or importance of which they understand. No one is expected to carry a burden beyond his strength and powers. There are natural-born magicians, mystic and occultists by birth, and by right of direct inheritance from a series of incarnations and eons of suffering and failures. These are passion-proof, so to say. No fires of earthly origin can fan into a flame any of their senses. No human voice can find response in their souls, except the great cry of humanity. These only may be certain of success. But they can be met only far and wide, and they pass through the narrow gates of occultism because they carry no personal luggage of human transitory sentiments along with them. They have got rid of the feelings of the lower personality, paralyzed thereby the astral animal, and the golden, but narrow gate is thrown open before them. Not so with those who have to carry yet for several incarnations the burden of sins committed in previous lives, and even in their present existence. For such, unless they proceed with great caution, the golden gate of wisdom may get transformed into the wide gate and the broad way, that leadeth unto destruction, and therefore many be they that enter in thereby. This is the gate of the occult arts, practiced for selfish motives and in the absence of the restraining and beneficent influence of Atma Vidya. We are in the Kali Yuga and its fatal influence is 1,000-fold more powerful in the West than it is in the East. Hence the easy praise made by the powers of the age of darkness in this cyclic struggle, and the many delusions under which the world is now laboring. One of these is the relative facility with which men fancy they can get at the gate and cross the threshold of occultism without any great sacrifice. It is the dream of most theosophists, one inspired by desire for power and personal selfishness, and it is not such feelings that can ever lead them to the coveted goal. For, as well said by one believed to have sacrificed himself for humanity, narrow is the gate and straitened the way that leadeth unto life eternal, and therefore, few be they that find it. So strait indeed, that at the bare mention of some of the preliminary difficulties the affrighted Western candidates turn back and retreat with a shudder. Let them stop here and attempt no more in their great weakness. For if, while turning their backs on the narrow gate, they are dragged by their desire for the occult one step in the direction of the broad and more inviting gates of that golden mystery which glitters in the light of illusion, woe to them. It can lead only to Dugpa, and they will be sure to find themselves very soon landed on that via fatale, over whose portal Dante read the words: Per me siva nella città dolente. Per me siva nell'eterno dolor. Per me siva tra la perduta gente. The blessings of publicity. A well-known public lecturer, a distinguished Egyptologist, said, in one of his lectures against the teachings of theosophy, a few suggestive words, which are now quoted and must be answered. It is a delusion to suppose there is anything in the experience or wisdom of the past, the ascertained results of which can only be communicated from beneath the cloak and mask of mystery. Explanation is the soul of science. They will tell you we cannot have their knowledge without living their life. Public experimental research, the printing press, and a free-thought platform, have abolished the need of mystery. It is no longer necessary for science to take the veil, as she was forced to do for security in times past. This is a very mistaken view in one aspect. Secrets of the purer and profounder life, not only may but must be made universally known. But there are secrets that kill in the arcana of occultism, and unless a man lives the life he cannot be entrusted with them. The late Professor Faraday had very serious doubts whether it was quite wise and reasonable to give out to the public at large certain discoveries of modern science. Chemistry had led to the invention of two terrible means of destruction in our century to allow it to fall into the hands of the profane. What man of sense, in the face of such fiendish applications of dynamite and other explosive substances as are made by those incarnations of the destroying power, who glory in calling themselves anarchists and socialists, would not agree with us in saying, far better for mankind that it should never have blasted a rock by modern perfected means, than that it should have shattered the limbs of 1% even of those who have been thus destroyed by the pitiless hand of Russian nihilists, Irish Fenians and anarchists. That such discoveries, and chiefly their murderous application, ought to have been withheld from public knowledge may be shown on the authority of statistics and commissions appointed to investigate and record the result of the evil done. The following information gathered from public papers will give an insight into what may be in store for wretched mankind. England alone, the center of civilization, has 21,268 firms fabricating and selling explosive substances. 5 but the centers of the dynamite trade, of infernal machines, and other such results of modern civilization, are chiefly at Philadelphia and New York. It is in the former city of brotherly love that the now most famous manufacturer of explosives flourishes. It is one of the well-known respectable citizens, the inventor and manufacturer of the most murderous dynamite toys, who called before the Senate of the United States anxious to adopt means for the repression of a too free trade in such implements, found an argument that ought to become immortalized for its cynical sophistry, my machines. That expert is reported to have said, are quite harmless to look at, as they may be manufactured in the shape of oranges, hats, boats, and anything one likes. Criminal is he who murders people by means of such machines, not he who manufactures them. The firm refuses to admit that were there no supply there would be no incentive for demand on the market, but insists that every demand should be satisfied by a supply ready at hand. That supply is the fruit of civilization and of the publicity given to the discovery of every murderous property in matter. What is it? As found in the report of the commission appointed to investigate the variety and character of the so-called infernal machines, so far the following implements of instantaneous human destruction are already on hand. The most fashionable of all among the many varieties fabricated by Mr. Holgate, are the ticker, the 8-day machine, the little exterminator, and the bottle machine. The ticker is in appearance like a piece of lead, a foot long and 4 inches thick. It contains an iron or steel tube, full of a kind of gunpowder invented by Holgate himself. That gunpowder, in appearance like any other common stuff of that name, has, however, an explosive power 200 times stronger than common gunpowder. The ticker containing thus a powder which equals in force 200 pounds of the common gunpowder. At one end of the machine is fastened an invisible clockwork meant to regulate the time of the explosion, which time may be fixed from 1 minute to 36 hours. The spark is produced by means of a steel needle which gives a spark at the touch hole, and communicates thereby the fire to the whole machine. The 8-day machine is considered the most powerful, but at the same time the most complicated, of all those invented. One must be familiar with handling it before a full success can be secured. It is owing to this difficulty that the terrible fate intended for London Bridge and its neighborhood was turned aside by the instantaneous killing instead of the 2 Fenian criminals. The size and appearance of that machine changes, Proteus-like, according to the necessity of smuggling it in one or another way, unperceived by the victims. It may be concealed in bread, in a basket of oranges, in a liquid, and so on. The commission of experts is said to have declared that its explosive power is such as to reduce to atoms instantly the largest edifice in the world. The little exterminator is an innocent-looking plain utensil having the shape of a modest jug. It contains neither dynamite nor powder, but secretes, nevertheless, a deadly gas, and has a hardly perceptible clockwork attached to its edge, the needle of which points to the time when that gas will effect its escape. In a shut-up room this new vril of lethal kind will smother to death, nearly instantaneously, every living being within a distance of 100 feet, the radius of the murderous jug. With these 3 latest novelties, in the high season of Christian civilization, the catalogue of the dynamiters is closed, all the rest belongs to the old fashion of the past years. It consists of hats, port cigars, bottles of ordinary kind, and even ladies' smelling bottles, filled with dynamite, nitroglycerin, etc., etc. Weapons, some of which, following unconsciously karmic law, killed many of the dynamiters in the last Chicago Revolution. Add to this the forthcoming long-promised Keely's vibratory force, capable of reducing in a few seconds a dead bullock to a heap of ashes. And then ask yourself if the Inferno of Dante as a locality can ever rival Earth in the production of more hellish engines of destruction. Thus, if purely material implements are capable of blowing up, from a few corners, the greatest cities of the globe. Provided the murderous weapons are guided by expert hands, what terrible dangers might not arise from magical occult secrets being revealed, and allowed to fall into the possession of ill-meaning persons. 1,000 times more dangerous and lethal are these, because neither the criminal hand, nor the immaterial, invisible weapon used, can ever be detected. The congenital black magicians, those who, to an innate propensity towards evil, unite highly developed mediumistic natures, are but too numerous in our age. It is nigh time then that psychologists and believers, at least, should cease advocating the beauties of publicity and claiming knowledge of the secrets of nature for all. It is not in our age of suggestion and explosives that occultism can open wide the doors of its laboratories except to those who do live the life. Hypnotism, and its relations to other modes of fascination. We are asked by H.C. and other fellows to answer the several queries hereafter propounded. We do so, but with a reservation. Our replies must be made from the standpoint of occultism alone, no consideration being given to such hypotheses of modern, another name for materialistic, science, as may clash with esoteric teachings. Q. What is hypnotism? How does it differ from animal magnetism, or mesmerism? ANS hypnotism is the new scientific name for the old ignorant superstition variously called fascination and enchantment. It is an antiquated lie transformed into a modern truth. The fact is there, but the scientific explanation of it is still wanting. By some it is believed that hypnotism is the result of an irritation artificially produced on the periphery of the nerves. That this irritation reacting upon, passes into the cells of the brain substance, causing by exhaustion a condition which is but another mode of sleep, hypnosis or hypnose. By others that it is simply a self-induced stupor, produced chiefly by imagination, etc., etc. It differs from animal magnetism where the hypnotic condition is produced by the braid method, which is a purely mechanical one, i.e. the fixing of the eyes on some bright spot, a metal or a crystal. It becomes animal magnetism, or mesmerism, when it is achieved by mesmeric passes on the patient, and for these reasons. When the first method is used, no electropsychic, or even electrophysical currents are at work, but simply the mechanical, molecular vibrations of the metal or crystal gazed at by the subject. It is the eye, the most occult organ of all, on the superficies of our body, which, by serving as a medium between that bit of metal or crystal and the brain, attunes the molecular vibrations of the nervous centers of the latter into unison, i.e. equality in the number of their respective oscillations, with the vibrations of the bright object held. And it is this unison which produces the hypnotic state. But in the second case, the right name for hypnotism would certainly be animal magnetism, or that so much derided term, mesmerism. For, in the hypnotization by preliminary passes, it is the human will, whether conscious or otherwise, of the operator himself, that acts upon the nervous system of the patient. And it is again through the vibrations, only atomic, not molecular, produced by that active energy called will in the ether of space, therefore, on quite a different plane, that the superhypnotic state, i.e., suggestion, etc., is induced. For those which we call will vibrations, and their aura, are absolutely distinct from the vibrations produced by the simply mechanical molecular motion, the two acting on two separate degrees of the cosmoterrestrial planes. Here, of course, a clear realization of that which is meant by will in occult sciences, is necessary. Q. In both, hypnotism and animal magnetism, there is an act of will in the operator, a transit of something from him to his patient, an effect upon the patient. What is the something transmitted in both cases? ANS. That which is transmitted has no name in European languages, and if we simply describe it as will, it loses all its meaning. The old and very much tabooed words, enchantment, fascination, glamour, and spell, and especially the verb, to bewitch, expressed far more suggestively the real action that took place during the process of such a transmission than the modern and meaningless terms, psychologize, and biologize. Occultism calls the force transmitted, the auric fluid, to distinguish it from the auric light. The fluid being a correlation of atoms on a higher plane, and a descent to this lower one, in the shape of impalpable and invisible plastic substances, generated and directed by the potential will. The auric light, or that which Reichenbach calls OD, a light that surrounds every animate and inanimate object in nature, is, on the other hand, but the astral reflection emanating from objects. Its particular color and colors, the combinations and varieties of the latter, denoting the state of the gunas, or qualities and characteristics of each special object and subject, the human being's aura being the strongest of all. Q. What is the rationale of vampirism? ANS. If by this word is meant the involuntary transmission of a portion of one's vitality, or life essence, by a kind of occult osmosis from one person to another, the latter being endowed, or afflicted rather, with such vampirizing faculty, then the act can become comprehensible only when we study well the nature and essence of the semi-substantial auric fluid spoken of just now. Like every other occult force, in nature, this end, an exosmosic process may be made beneficent or maleficent, either unconsciously or at will. When a healthy operator mesmerizes a patient with a determined desire to relieve and cure him, the exhaustion felt by the former is proportionate to the relief given. A process of endosmos has taken place, the healer having parted with a portion of his vital aura to benefit the sick man. Vampirism, on the other hand, is a blind and mechanical process, generally produced without the knowledge of either the absorber, or the vampirized party. It is conscious or unconscious black magic, as the case may be. For in the case of trained adepts and sorcerers, the process is produced consciously and with the guidance of the will. In both cases the agent of transmission is a magnetic and attractive faculty, terrestrial and physiological in its results, yet generated and produced on the four-dimensional plane, the realm of atoms. Q. Under what circumstances is hypnotism black magic? ANS. Under those just discussed, but to cover the subject fully, even by giving a few instances, demands more space than we can spare for these answers. Sufficient to say that whenever the motive which actuates the operator is selfish, or detrimental to any living being or beings, all such acts are classed by us as black magic. The healthy vital fluid imparted by the physician who mesmerizes his patient, can and does cure, but too much of it will kill. This statement receives its explanation in our answer to question 6, when showing that the vibratory experiment shatters a tumbler to pieces. Q. Is there any difference between hypnosis produced by mechanical means, such as revolving mirrors, and that produced by the direct gaze of the operator, fascination? ANS. This difference is, we believe, already pointed out in the answer to question 1. The gaze of the operator is more potent, hence more dangerous, than the simple mechanical passes of the hypnotizer, who, in 9 cases out of 10, does not know how, and therefore cannot will. The students of esoteric science must be aware by the very laws of the occult correspondences that the former action is performed on the first plane of matter, the lowest, while the latter, which necessitates a well-concentrated will, has to be enacted, if the operator is a profane novice, on the 4th, and if he is anything of an occultist on the 5th plane. Q. Why should a bit of crystal or a bright button throw one person into the hypnotic state and affect in no way another person? An answer to this would, we think, solve more than one perplexity. ANS. Science has offered several varied hypotheses upon the subject, but has not, so far, accepted any one of these as definite. This is because all such speculations revolve in the vicious circle of material-physical phenomena with their blind forces and mechanical theories. The auric fluid is not recognized by the men of science, and therefore, they reject it. But have they not believed for years in the efficacy of metallotherapeutic, the influence of these metals being due to the action of their electric fluids or currents on the nervous system. And this, simply because an analogy was found to exist between the activity of this system and electricity. The theory failed, because it clashed with the most careful observation and experiments. First of all, it was contradicted by a fundamental fact exhibited in the said metallotherapeutic, whose characteristic peculiarity showed, a. that by no means every metal acted on every nervous disease, one patient being sensitive to some one metal, while all others produced no effect upon him. And, b. that the patients affected by certain metals were few and exceptional. This showed that, electric fluids, operating on and curing diseases existed only in the imagination of the theorists. Had they had any actual existence, then all metals would affect in a greater or lesser degree, all patients, and every metal, taken separately, would affect every case of nervous disease, the conditions for generating such fluids being, in the given cases, precisely the same. Thus Dr. Charcot having vindicated Dr. Burke, the once discredited discoverer of metallotherapeutic, Schiff and others discredited all those who believed in electric fluids, and these seem now to be given up in favor of molecular motion, which now reigns supreme in physiology, for the time being, of course. But now arises a question: are the real nature, behavior and conditions of motion known any better than the nature, behavior and conditions of the fluids? It is to be doubted. Anyhow, occultism is audacious enough to maintain that electric or magnetic fluids, the two being really identical, are due in their essence and origin to that same molecular motion, now transformed into atomic energy. 6. To which every other phenomenon in nature is also due. Indeed, when the needle of a galvano or electrometer fails to show any oscillations denoting the presence of electric or magnetic fluids, this does not prove in the least that there are none such to record, but simply that having passed on to another and higher plane of action, the electrometer can no longer be affected by the energy displayed on a plane with which it is entirely disconnected. The above had to be explained, in order to show that the nature of the force transmitted from one man or object to another man or object, whether in hypnotism, electricity, metallotherapeutic, or fascination, is the same in essence, varying only in degree, and modified according to the subplane of matter it is acting on. Of which subplanes, as every occultist knows, there are 7 on our terrestrial plane as there are on every other. Q. Is science entirely wrong in its definition of the hypnotic phenomena? ANS. It has no definition, so far. Now if there is one thing upon which occultism agrees, to a certain degree, with the latest discoveries of physical science, it is that all the bodies endowed with the property of inducing and calling metallotherapeutic and other analogous phenomena, have, their great variety notwithstanding, one feature in common. They are all the fountain heads and the generators of rapid molecular oscillations, which, whether through transmitting agents or direct contact, communicate themselves to the nervous system, changing thereby the rhythm of nervous vibrations, on the sole condition, however, of being what is called, in unison. Now unison does not always imply the sameness of nature, or of essence, but simply the sameness of degree, a similarity with regard to gravity and acuteness, and equal potentialities for intensity of sound or motion. A bell may be in unison with a violin, and a flute with an animal or a human organ. Moreover, the rate of the number of vibrations, especially in an organic animal cell or organ, changes in accordance with the state of health and general condition. Hence the cerebral nervous centers of a hypnotic subject, while in perfect unison, in potential degree in essential original activity, with the object he gazes at, may yet, owing to some organic disturbance, be at the given moment at loggerheads with it, in respect to the number of their respective vibrations. In such case no hypnotic condition ensues, or no unison at all may exist between his nervous cells and the cells of the crystal or metal he is made to gaze at, in which case that particular object can never have any effect upon him. This amounts to saying that to ensure success in a hypnotic experiment, 2 conditions are requisite. A. As every organic or inorganic body in nature is distinguished by its fixed molecular oscillations, it is necessary to find out which are those bodies which will act in unison with one or another human nervous system. And, b. To remember that the molecular oscillations of the former can influence the nervous action of the latter, only when the rhythms of their respective vibrations coincide, i.e., when the number of their oscillations is made identical. Which, in the cases of hypnotism induced by mechanical means, is achieved through the medium of the eye. Therefore, though the difference between hypnosis produced by mechanical means, and that induced by the direct gaze of the operator, plus his will, depends on the plane on which the same phenomenon is produced. Still the fascinating or subduing agent is created by the same force at work. In the physical world and its material planes, it is called motion. In the worlds of mentality and metaphysics it is known as will, the many-faced magician throughout all nature. As the rate of vibrations, molecular motion, in metals, woods, crystals, etc., alters under the effect of heat, cold, etc., so do the cerebral molecules change their rate, in the same way, i.e., their rate is raised or lowered. And this is what really takes place in the phenomenon of hypnotism. In the case of gazing, it is the eye, the chief agent of the will of the active operator, but a slave and traitor when this will is dormant, that, unconsciously to the patient or subject, attunes the oscillations of his cerebral nervous centers to the rate of the vibrations of the object gazed at by catching the rhythm of the latter and passing it on to the brain. But in the case of direct passes, it is the will of the operator radiating through his eye that produces the required unison between his will and the will of the person operated upon. For, out of two objects attuned in unison, as two chords, for instance, one will always be weaker than the other, and thus have mastery over the other and even the potentiality of destroying its weaker correspondent. So true is this, that we can call upon physical science to corroborate this fact. Take the sensitive flame as a case in hand. Science tells us that if a note be struck in unison with the ratio of the vibrations of the heat molecules, the flames will respond immediately to the sound, or note struck, that it will dance and sing in rhythm with the sounds. But occult science adds, that the flame may also be extinguished if the sound is intensified, vide Isis Unveiled, Volume 2, 606 and 607. Another proof. Take a wineglass or tumbler of very fine and clear glass. Produce, by striking it gently with a silver spoon, a well-determined note, after which reproduce the same note by rubbing its rim with a damp finger, and, if you are successful, the glass will immediately crack and be shattered. Indifferent to every other sound, the glass will not resist the great intensity of its own fundamental note, for that particular vibration will cause such a commotion in its particles, that the whole fabric will fall in pieces. Q. What becomes of diseases cured by hypnotism? Are they really cured or are they postponed, or do they appear in another form? Are diseases karma, and, if so, is it right to attempt to cure them? ANS. Hypnotic suggestion may cure forever, and it may not. All depends on the degree of magnetic relations between the operator and the patient. If karmic, they will be only postponed, and return in some other form, not necessarily of disease, but as a punitive evil of another sort. It is always right to try and alleviate suffering whenever we can, and to do our best for it. Because a man suffers justly imprisonment, and catches cold in his damp cell, is it a reason why the prison doctor should not try to cure him of it? Q. Is it necessary that the hypnotic suggestions of the operator should be spoken? Is it not enough for him to think them, and may not even he be ignorant or unconscious of the bent he is impressing on his subject? ANS. Certainly not, if the rapport between the two is once for all firmly established. Thought is more powerful than speech in cases of a real subjugation of the will of the patient to that of his operator. But, on the other hand, unless the suggestion made is for the good only of the subject, and entirely free from any selfish motive, a suggestion by thought is an act of black magic still more pregnant with evil consequences than a spoken suggestion. It is always wrong and unlawful to deprive a man of his free will, unless for his own or society's good, and even the former has to be done with great discrimination. Occultism regards all such promiscuous attempts as black magic and sorcery, whether conscious or otherwise. Q. Do the motive and character of the operator affect the result, immediate or remote? ANS. In so far as the hypnotizing process becomes under his operation either white or black magic, as the last answer shows. Q. Is it wise to hypnotize a patient not only out of disease, but out of a habit, such as drinking or lying? ANS. It is an act of charity and kindness, and this is next to wisdom. For, although the dropping of his vicious habits will add nothing to his good karma, which it would, had his efforts to reform been personal, of his own free will, and necessitating a great mental and physical struggle, still a successful suggestion prevents him from generating more bad karma, and adding constantly to the previous record of his transgressions. Q. What is it that a faith healer, when successful, practices upon himself? What tricks is he playing with his principles and with his karma? ANS. Imagination is a potent help in every event of our lives. Imagination acts on faith, and both are the draftsmen who prepare the sketches for will to engrave, more or less deeply, on the rocks of obstacles and opposition with which the path of life is strewn. Says Paracelsus, faith must confirm the imagination, for faith establishes the will. Determined will is the beginning of all magical operations. It is because men do not perfectly imagine and believe the result, that the arts, of magic, are uncertain, while they might be perfectly certain. This is all the secret. Half, if not 2/3 of our ailings and diseases are the fruit of our imagination and fears. Destroy the latter and give another bent to the former, and nature will do the rest. There is nothing sinful or injurious in the methods per se. They turn to harm only when belief in his power becomes too arrogant and marked in the faith healer, and when he thinks he can will away such diseases as need, if they are not to be fatal, the immediate help of expert surgeons and physicians. Black magic in science. Commence research where modern conjecture closes its faithless wings, Bulwer's Zanoni. The flat denial of yesterday has become the scientific axiom of today, common sense aphorisms. Thousands of years ago the Phrygian dactyls, the initiated priests, spoken of as the magicians and exorcists of sickness, healed diseases by magnetic processes. It was claimed that they had obtained these curative powers from the powerful breath of Cybele, the many-breasted goddess, the daughter of Coelus and Terra. Indeed, her genealogy and the myths attached to it show Cybele as the personification and type of the vital essence, whose source was located by the ancients between the earth and the starry sky, and who was regarded as the very fons vitae of all that lives and breathes. The mountain air being placed nearer to that fount fortifies health and prolongs man's existence, hence, Cybele's life, as an infant, is shown in her myth as having been preserved on a mountain. This was before that Magna and Bona Dea, the prolific Mater, became transformed into Ceres Demeter, the patroness of the Eleusinian mysteries. Animal magnetism, now called suggestion and hypnotism, was the principal agent in theurgic mysteries as also in the Asclepiae, the healing temples of Aesculapius, where the patients once admitted were treated, during the process of incubation, magnetically, during their sleep. This creative and life-giving force, denied and laughed at when named theurgic magic, accused for the last century of being principally based on superstition and fraud, whenever referred to as mesmerism, is now called hypnotism, Charcotism, suggestion, psychology, and what not. But, whatever the expression chosen, it will ever be a loose one if used without a proper qualification. For when epitomized with all its collateral sciences, which are all sciences within the science, it will be found to contain possibilities the nature of which has never been even dreamt of by the oldest and most learned professors of the orthodox physical science. The latter, authorities so-called, are no better, indeed, than innocent bald infants, when brought face to face with the mysteries of antediluvian mesmerism. As stated repeatedly before, the blossoms of magic, whether white or black, divine or infernal, spring all from one root. The breath of Cybele, Akasa Tattva, in India, is the one chief agent, and it underlay the so-called miracles and supernatural phenomena in all ages, as in every clime. As the parent root or essence is universal, so are its effects innumerable. Even the greatest adepts can hardly say where its possibilities must stop. The key to the very alphabet of these theurgic powers was lost after the last Gnostic had been hunted to death by the ferocious persecution of the Church. And as gradually mysteries, hierophants, theophany and theurgy became obliterated from the minds of men until they remained in them only as a vague tradition, all this was finally forgotten. But at the period of the Renaissance, in Germany, a learned theosophist, a philosopher per ignem, as they called themselves, rediscovered some of the lost secrets of the Phrygian priests and of the Asclepia. It was the great and unfortunate physician-occultist, Paracelsus, the greatest alchemist of the age. That genius it was, who during the Middle Ages was the first to publicly recommend the action of the magnet in the cure of certain diseases. Theophrastus Paracelsus, the quack and drunken impostor, in the opinion of the said scientific, bald infants of his day, and of their successors in ours, inaugurated among other things in the 17th century that which has become a profitable branch in trade in the 19th. It is he who invented and used for the cure of various muscular and nervous diseases magnetized bracelets, armlets, belts, rings, collars and leglets. Only his magnets cured far more efficaciously than do the electric belts of today. Van Helmont, the successor of Paracelsus, and Robert Fludd, the alchemist and Rosicrucian, also applied magnets in the treatment of their patients. Mesmer in the 18th, and the Marquis de Peisker in the 19th century only followed in their footsteps. In the large curative establishment founded by Mesmer at Vienna, he employed, besides magnetism, electricity, metals and a variety of woods. His fundamental doctrine was that of the alchemists. He believed that metals, as also woods and plants have all an affinity with and bear a close relation to, the human organism. Everything in the universe has developed from one homogeneous primordial substance differentiated into incalculable species of matter, and everything is destined to return thereinto. The secret of healing, he maintained, lies in the knowledge of correspondences and affinities between kindred atoms. Find that metal, wood, stone, or plant that has the most correspondential affinity with the body of the sufferer. And, whether through internal or external use, that particular agent imparting to the patient additional strength to fight disease, developed generally through the introduction of some foreign element into the constitution, and to expel it, will lead invariably to his cure. Many and marvelous were such cures effected by Anton Mesmer. Subjects with heart disease were made well. A lady of high station, condemned to death, was completely restored to health by the application of certain sympathetic woods. Mesmer himself, suffering from acute rheumatism, cured it completely by using specially prepared magnets. In 1774 he too happened to come across the theurgic secret of direct vital transmission. And so highly interested was he, that he abandoned all his old methods to devote himself entirely to the new discovery. Henceforward he mesmerized by gaze and passes, the natural magnets being abandoned. The mysterious effects of such manipulations were called by him, animal magnetism. This brought to Mesmer a mass of followers and disciples. The new force was experimented with in almost every city and town of Europe and found everywhere an actual fact. About 1780, Mesmer settled in Paris, and soon the whole metropolis, from the royal family down to the last hysterical bourgeois, were at his feet. The clergy got frightened and cried, "The devil!" The licensed leeches felt an ever-growing deficit in their pockets, and the aristocracy and the court found themselves on the verge of madness from mere excitement. No use repeating too well-known facts, but the memory of the reader may be refreshed with a few details he may have forgotten. It so happened that just about that time the official academical science felt very proud. After centuries of mental stagnation in the realm of medicine and general ignorance, several determined steps in the direction of real knowledge had finally been made. Natural sciences had achieved a decided success, and chemistry and physics were on a fair way to progress. As the savants of a century ago had not yet grown to that height of sublime modesty which characterizes so preeminently their modern successors, they felt very much puffed up with their greatness. The moment for praiseworthy humility, followed by a confession of the relative insignificance of the knowledge of the period, and even of modern knowledge for the matter of that, compared to that which the ancients knew, had not yet arrived. Those were days of naive boasting of the peacocks of science displaying in a body their tails, and demanding universal recognition and admiration. The Sir Oracles were not as numerous as they are now, yet their number was considerable. And indeed, had not the dull cameras of public fairs been just visited with ostracism? Had not the leeches well nigh disappeared to make room for diplomaed physicians with royal licenses to kill and bury a piacer ad libitum? Hence, the nodding immortal in his academical chair was regarded as the sole competent authority in the decision of questions he had never studied, and for rendering verdicts about that which he had never heard of. It was the reign of reason, and of science, in its teens, the beginning of the great deadly struggle between theology and facts, spirituality and materialism. In the educated classes of society too much faith had been succeeded by no faith at all. The cycle of science worship had just set in, with its pilgrimages to the Academy, the Olympus where the 40 immortals are enshrined, and its raids upon everyone who refused to manifest a noisy admiration, a kind of juvenile calves enthusiasm. At the door of the fane of science. When Mesmer arrived, Paris divided its allegiance between the Church which attributed all kinds of phenomena except its own divine miracles to the devil, and the Academy, which believed in neither God nor devil, but only in its own infallible wisdom. But there were minds which would not be satisfied with either of these beliefs. Therefore, after Mesmer had forced all Paris to crowd to his halls, waiting hours to obtain a place in the chair round the miraculous Bacchae, some people thought that it was time real truth should be found out. They had laid their legitimate desires at the royal feet, and the king forthwith commanded his learned Academy to look into the matter. Then it was, that awakening from their chronic nap, the immortals appointed a committee of investigation, among which was Benjamin Franklin, and chose some of the oldest, wisest and baldest among their infants to watch over the committee. This was in 1784. Every one knows what was the report of the latter and the final decision of the Academy. The whole transaction looks now like a general rehearsal of the play, one of the acts of which was performed by the Dialectical Society of London and some of England's greatest scientists, some 80 years later. Indeed, notwithstanding a counter-report by Dr. Jussieu, an academician of the highest rank, and the court physician D'Islan, who, as eyewitnesses to the most striking phenomena, demanded that a careful investigation should be made by the medical faculty of the therapeutic effects of the magnetic fluid, their demand fell through. The Academy disbelieved her most eminent scientists. Even Sir B. Franklin, so much at home with cosmic electricity, would not recognize its fountainhead and primordial source, and along with Bailly, Lavoisier, Magendie, and others, proclaimed mesmerism a delusion. Nor had the second investigation which followed the first, namely in 1825, any better results. The report was once more squashed, vide Isis Unveiled, Volume 1, pages 171 to 176. Even now when experiment has amply demonstrated that mesmerism, or animal magnetism, now known as hypnotism, a sorry effect, forsooth, of the breath of Cybele, is a fact, we yet get the majority of scientists denying its actual existence. Small fry as it is in the majestic array of experimental psychomagnetic phenomena, even hypnotism seems too incredible, too mysterious, for our Darwinists and Haecelians. One needs too much moral courage, you see, to face the suspicion of one's colleagues, the doubt of the public, and the giggling of fools. Mystery and charlatanism go hand in hand, they say. And self-respect and the dignity of the profession, as Magendie remarks in his Physiologie Humaine, demand that the well-informed physician should remember how readily mystery glides into charlatanism. Pity the well-informed physician should fail to remember that physiology among the rest is full of mystery, profound, inexplicable mystery from A to Z, and ask whether, starting from the above truism, he should not throw overboard biology and physiology as the greatest pieces of charlatanry in modern science. Nevertheless, a few in the well-meaning minority of our physicians have taken up seriously the investigation of hypnotism. But even they, having been reluctantly compelled to confess the reality of its phenomena, still persist in seeing in such manifestations no higher a factor at work than the purely material and physical forces, and deny these their legitimate name of animal magnetism. But as the Reverend Mr. Hoyes, of whom more presently, just said in the Daily Graphic, the Charcot phenomena are, for all that, in many ways identical with the mesmeric phenomena, and hypnotism must properly be considered rather as a branch of mesmerism than as something distinct from it. Anyhow, Mesmer's facts, now generally accepted, were at first stoutly denied. And they are still so denied. But while they deny mesmerism, they rush into hypnotism, despite the now scientifically recognized dangers of this science, in which medical practitioners in France are far ahead of the English. And what the former say is, that between the two states of mesmerism, or magnetism as they call it, across the water, and hypnotism, there is an abyss. That one is beneficent, the other maleficent, as it evidently must be. Since, according to both occultism and modern psychology, hypnotism is produced by the withdrawal of the nervous fluid from the capillary nerves, which being, so to say, the sentries that keep the doors of our senses opened, getting anesthetized under hypnotic conditions, allow these to get closed. A. H. Simonin reveals many a wholesome truth in his excellent work, Solution du problème de la suggestion hypnotique. 7. Thus he shows that while, in magnetism, mesmerism, there occurs in the subject a great development of moral faculties, that his thoughts and feelings become loftier, and the senses acquire an abnormal acuteness. In hypnotism, on the contrary, the subject becomes a simple mirror. It is suggestion which is the true motor of every action in the hypnotic, and if, occasionally, seemingly marvelous actions are produced, these are due to the hypnotizer, not to the subject. Again, in hypnotism instinct, i.e., the animal, reaches its greatest development, so much so, indeed, that the aphorism extremes meet can never receive a better application than to magnetism and hypnotism. How true these words, also, as to the difference between the mesmerized and the hypnotized subjects. In one, his ideal nature, his moral self, the reflection of his divine nature, are carried to their extreme limits, and the subject becomes almost a celestial being, un ange. In the other, it is his instincts which develop in a most surprising fashion. The hypnotic lowers himself to the level of the animal. From a physiological standpoint, magnetism, mesmerism, is comforting and curative, and hypnotism, which is but the result of an unbalanced state, is most dangerous. Thus the adverse report drawn by Bailey at the end of last century has had dire effects in the present, but it had its karma also. Intended to kill the mesmeric craze, it reacted as a death blow to the public confidence in scientific decrees. In our day the non-possumus of the Royal Colleges and Academies is quoted on the stock exchange of the world's opinion at a price almost as low as the non-possumus of the Vatican. The days of authority, whether human or divine, are fast gliding away. And we see already gleaming on future horizons but one tribunal, supreme and final, before which mankind will bow, the tribunal of fact and truth. To this tribunal without appeal even liberal clergymen and famous preachers make obeisance in our day. The parts have now changed hands, and in many instances it is the successors of those who fought tooth and nail for the reality of the devil and his direct interference with psychic phenomena, for long centuries, who come out publicly to upbraid science. A remarkable instance of this is found in an excellent letter, just mentioned, by the Reverend Mr. Hoyes to the Graphic. The learned preacher seems to share our indignation at the unfairness of the modern scientists, at their suppression of truth, and ingratitude to their ancient teachers. His letter is so interesting that its best points must be immortalized in our magazine. Here are some fragments of it. Thus he asks, why can't our scientific men say, we have blundered about mesmerism, it's practically true. Not because they are men of science, but simply because they are human. No doubt it is humiliating when you have dogmatized in the name of science to say, I was wrong. But is it not more humiliating to be found out? And is it not most humiliating, after shuffling and wriggling hopelessly in the inexorable meshes of serried facts, to collapse suddenly, and call the hated net a suitable enclosure, in which forsooth, you don't mind being caught? Now this, as it seems to me, is precisely what Messrs. Charcot and the French hypnotists and their medical admirers in England are doing. Ever since Mesmer's death at the age of 80, in 1815, the French and English faculty, with some honorable exceptions, have ridiculed and denied the facts as well as the theories of Mesmer, but now, in 1890, a host of scientists suddenly agree. While wiping out as best they may the name of Mesmer, to rob him of all his phenomena, which they quietly appropriate under the name of hypnotism, suggestion, therapeutic magnetism, psychopathic massage, and all the rest of it. Well, what's in a name? I care more for things than names, but I reverence the pioneers of thought who have been cast out, trodden underfoot, and crucified by the orthodox of all ages, and I think the least scientists can do for men like Mesmer, Dupotet, Peisger, or Mayo and Eliotson, now they are gone, is to build their sepulchres. But Mr. Hoyes might have added instead, the amateur hypnotists of science dig with their own hands the graves of many a man and woman's intellect. They enslave and paralyze free will in their subjects, turn immortal men into soulless, irresponsible automata, and vivisect their souls with as much unconcern as they vivisect the bodies of rabbits and dogs. In short, they are fast blooming into sorcerers, and are turning science into a vast field of black magic. The Rev. writer, however, lets the culprits off easily. And, remarking that he accepts the distinction between mesmerism and hypnotism, without pledging himself to any theory, he adds, "I am mainly concerned with the facts. And what I want to know is why these cures and abnormal states are trumpeted about as modern discoveries, while the faculty still deride or ignore their great predecessors without having themselves a theory which they can agree upon or a single fact which can be called new. The truth is we are just blundering back with toil to work over again the old disused minds of the ancients. The rediscovery of these occult sciences is exactly matched by the slow recovery of sculpture and painting in modern Europe. Here is the history of occult science in a nutshell. 1. Once known. 2. Lost. 3. Rediscovered. 4. Denied. 5. Reaffirmed, and by slow degrees, under new names, victorious. The evidence for all this is exhaustive and abundant. Here it may suffice to notice that Diodorus Siculus mentions how the Egyptian priests, ages before Christ, attributed clairvoyance induced for therapeutic purposes to Isis. Strabo ascribes the same to Serapis, while Galen mentions a temple near Memphis famous for these hypnotic cures. Pythagoras, who won the confidence of the Egyptian priests, is full of it. Aristophanes in Plutus describes in some detail a mesmeric cure, Kyprota men de tes kephales ephipsato, etc., and first he began to handle the head. Caelius Aurelianus describes manipulations, 1569, for disease, conducting the hands from the superior to the inferior parts, and there was an old Latin proverb, ubi dolor ibi digitus, where pain, their finger. But time would fail me to tell of Paracelsus, 1462, 8 and his Deep Secret of Magnetism, of Van Helmont, 1644, 9 and his Faith in the Power of the Hand in Disease. Much in the writings of both these men was only made clear to the moderns by the experiments of Mesmer, and in view of modern hypnotists it is clearly with him and his disciples that we have chiefly to do. He claimed, no doubt, to transmit an animal magnetic fluid, which I believe the hypnotists deny. They do. But so did the scientists with regard to more than one truth. To deny an animal magnetic fluid is surely no more absurd than to deny the circulation of the blood, as they have so energetically done. A few additional details about mesmerism given by Mr. Hoyes may prove interesting. Thus he reminds us of the answer written by the much-wronged Mesmer to the academicians after their unfavorable report, and refers to it as prophetic words. You say that Mesmer will never hold up his head again. If such is the destiny of the man, it is not the destiny of the truth, which is in its nature imperishable, and will shine forth sooner or later in the same or some other country with more brilliancy than ever. And its triumph will annihilate its miserable detractors. Mesmer left Paris in disgust, and retired to Switzerland to die, but the illustrious Dr. Jussieu became a convert. Lavater carried Mesmer's system to Germany, while Pisgah and Deleuze spread it throughout provincial France, forming innumerable, harmonic societies devoted to the study of therapeutic magnetism and its allied phenomena of thought transference, hypnotism, and clairvoyance. Some 20 years ago I became acquainted with perhaps the most illustrious disciple of Mesmer, the aged Baron du Potet. 10 round this man's therapeutic and mesmeric exploits raged, between 1830 and 1846, a bitter controversy throughout France. A murderer had been tracked, convicted, and executed solely on evidence supplied by one of du Potet's clairvoyants. The Juge de Paix admitted thus much in open court. This was too much for even skeptical Paris, and the Academy determined to sit again and, if possible, crush out the superstition. They sat, but, strange to say, this time they were converted. Itard, Fouquier, Gersant, Bourdois de la Motte, the cream of the French faculty, pronounced the phenomena of mesmerism to be genuine, cures, trances, clairvoyance, thought transference, even reading from closed books. And from that time an elaborate nomenclature was invented, blotting out as far as possible the detested names of the indefatigable men who had compelled the scientific assent, while enrolling the main facts vouched for by Mesmer, du Potet, and Pisgah among the undoubted phenomena to be accepted, on whatever theory, by medical science. Then comes the turn of this foggy island and its befogged scientists. Meanwhile, goes on the writer, England was more stubborn. In 1846 the celebrated Dr. Eliot's son, a popular practitioner, with a vast clientele, pronounced the famous Harveian oration, in which he confessed his belief in mesmerism. He was denounced by the doctors with such thorough results that he lost his practice, and died well nigh ruined, if not heartbroken. The Mesmeric Hospital in Marylebone Road has been established by him. Operations were successfully performed under mesmerism, and all the phenomena which have lately occurred at Leeds and elsewhere to the satisfaction of the doctors were produced in Marylebone 56 years ago. 35 years ago Professor Lister did the same, but the introduction of chloroform being more speedy and certain as an anesthetic, killed for a time the mesmeric treatment. The public interest in mesmerism died down, and the Mesmeric Hospital in the Marylebone Road, which had been under a cloud since the suppression of Eliot's son, was at last closed. Lately we know what has been the fate of Mesmer and mesmerism. Mesmer is spoken of in the same breath with Count Cagliostro, and mesmerism itself is seldom mentioned at all, but, then, we hear plenty of electrobiology, therapeutic magnetism and hypnotism, just so. Oh, shades of Mesmer, Pisgah, du Potet, Eliot's son, sic vos non vobis. Still, I say palmum cum marut ferat. When I knew Baron du Potet he was on the brink of the grave, and nearly 80 years old. He was an ardent admirer of Mesmer. He had devoted his whole life to therapeutic magnetism, and he was absolutely dogmatic on the point that a real magnetic aura passed from the mesmerist to the patient. I will show you this, he said one day, as we both stood by the bedside of a patient in so deep a trance that we ran needles into her hands and arms without exciting the least sign or movement. The old Baron continued, I will, at the distance of a foot or two, determine slight convulsions in any part of her body by simply moving my hand above the part, without any contact. He began at the shoulder, which soon set up a twitching. Quiet being restored, he tried the elbow, then the wrist, then the knee, the convulsions increasing in intensity according to the time employed. Are you quite satisfied? I said, quite satisfied. And, continued he, any patient that I have tested I will undertake to operate upon through a brick wall at a time and place where the patient shall be ignorant of my presence or my purpose. This, added du Potet, was one of the experiences which most puzzled the academicians at Paris. I repeated the experiment again and again under every test and condition, with almost invariable success, until the most skeptical was forced to give in. We have accused science of gliding full sail down to the maelstrom of black magic, by practicing that which ancient psychology, the most important branch of the occult sciences, has always declared as sorcery in its application to the inner man. We are prepared to maintain what we say. We mean to prove it one of these days, in some future articles, basing ourselves on facts published and the actions produced by the hypnotism of vivisectionists themselves. That they are unconscious sorcerers does not make away with the fact that they do practice the black art bel et bien. In short, the situation is this. The minority of the learned physicians and other scientists experiment in hypnotism because they have come to see something in it, while the majority of the members of the RCP still deny the actuality of animal magnetism in its mesmeric form, even under its modern mask, hypnotism. The former, entirely ignorant of the fundamental laws of animal magnetism, experiment at haphazard, almost blindly. To remain consistent with their declarations, a. that hypnotism is not mesmerism, and b. that a magnetic aura or fluid passing from the mesmerizer, or hypnotizer, is pure fallacy, they have no right, of course, to apply the laws of the older to the younger science. Hence they interfere with, and awaken to action the most dangerous forces of nature, without being aware of it. Instead of healing diseases, the only use to which animal magnetism under its new name can be legitimately applied, they often inoculate the subjects with their own physical as well as mental ills and vices. For this, and the ignorance of their colleagues of the minority, the disbelieving majority of the Sadducees are greatly responsible. For, by opposing them, they impede free action, and take advantage of the Hippocratic oath, to make them powerless to admit and do much that the believers might and would otherwise do. But as Dr. A. Test truly says in his work, there are certain unfortunate truths which compromise those who believe in them, and those especially who are so candid as to avow them publicly. Thus the reason of hypnotism not being studied on its proper lines is self-evident. Years ago it was remarked, it is the duty of the academy and medical authorities to study mesmerism, i.e. the occult sciences in its spirit, and to subject it to trials, finally, to take away the use and practice of it from persons quite strangers to the art, who abuse this means, and make it an object of lucre and speculation. He who uttered this great truth was the voice speaking in the desert. But those having some experience in occult psychology would go further. They would say it is incumbent on every scientific body, nay, on every government, to put an end to public exhibitions of this sort. By trying the magic effect of the human will on weaker wills, by deriding the existence of occult forces in nature, forces whose name is legion, and yet calling out these, under the pretext that they are no independent forces at all. Not even psychic in their nature, but connected with known physical laws, Binet and fear, men in authority are virtually responsible for all the dire effects that are and will be following their dangerous public experiments. Verily karma, the terrible but just retributive law, will visit all those who develop the most awful results in the future, generated at those public exhibitions for the amusement of the profane. Let them only think of dangers bred, of new forms of diseases, mental and physical, begotten by such insane handling of psychic will. This is as bad on the moral plane as the artificial introduction of animal matter into the human blood, by the infamous Brown Sequard method, is on the physical. They laugh at the occult sciences and deride mesmerism. Yet this century will not have passed away before they have undeniable proofs that the idea of a crime suggested for experiment's sake is not removed by a reversed current of the will as easily as it is inspired. They may learn that if the outward expression of the idea of a misdeed, suggested, may fade out at the will of the operator, the active living germ artificially implanted does not disappear with it. That once dropped into the seat of the human, or, rather, the animal, passions, it may lie dormant there for years sometimes, to become suddenly awakened by some unforeseen circumstance into realization. Crying children frightened into silence by the suggestion of a monster, a devil standing in the corner, by a foolish nurse, have been known to become insane 20 or 30 years later on the same subject. There are mysterious, secret drawers, dark nooks and hiding places in the labyrinth of our memory, still unknown to physiologists, and which open only once, rarely twice, in man's lifetime, and that only under very abnormal and peculiar conditions. But when they do, it is always some heroic deed committed by a person the least calculated for it, or a terrible crime perpetrated, the reason for which remains forever a mystery. Thus experiments in suggestion, by persons ignorant of the occult laws, are the most dangerous of pastimes. The action and reaction of ideas on the inner lower ego has never been studied so far, because that ego itself is terra incognita, even when not denied, to the men of science. Moreover, such performances before a promiscuous public are a danger in themselves. Men of undeniable scientific education who experiment on hypnotism in public, lend thereby the sanction of their names to such performances. And then every unworthy speculator acute enough to understand the process may, by developing by practice and perseverance the same force in himself, apply it to his own selfish, often criminal, ends. Result on karmic lines, every hypnotist, every man of science, however well-meaning and honorable, once he has allowed himself to become the unconscious instructor of one who learns but to abuse the sacred science, becomes, of course, morally the confederate of every crime committed by this means. Such is the consequence of public, hypnotic experiments which thus lead to, and virtually are, black magic. The signs of the times. It is intensely interesting to follow season after season the rapid evolution and change of public thought in the direction of the mystical. The educated mind is most undeniably attempting to free itself from the heavy fetters of materialism. The ugly caterpillar is writhing in the agonies of death, under the powerful efforts of the psychic butterfly to escape from its science-built prison, and every day brings some new glad tidings of one or more such mental births to light. As the New York Path truly remarks in its September issue, when theosophical and kindred topics are made the texts for novels, and, we may add, scientific essays and brochures, the implication is that interest in them has become diffused through all social ranks. That kind of literature is, paradoxically, proof that occultism has passed beyond the region of careless amusement and entered that of serious inquiry. The reader has but to throw a retrospective glance at the publications of the last few years to find that such topics as mysticism, magic, sorcery, spiritualism, theosophy, mesmerism, or, as it is now called, hypnotism, all the various branches in short of the occult side of nature, are becoming predominant in every kind of literature. They visibly increase in proportion to the efforts made to discredit the movements in the cause of truth, and strangle inquiry, whether on the field of theosophy or spiritualism, by trying to besmear their most prominent heralds, pioneers and defenders, with tar and feathers. The keynote for mystic and theosophic literature was Marion Crawford's Mr. Isaacs. It was followed by his Zoroaster. Then followed The Romance of Two Worlds, by Marie Corelli, or Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The Fallen Idol, by Anstey, King Solomon's Mines and the Thrice Famous She, by Rider Haggard, Affinities and the Brother of the Shadow, by Mrs. Campbell Praed, Edmund Downey's House of Tears, and many others less noticeable. And now there comes a fresh outburst in Florence Marriott's Daughter of the Tropics, and F. C. Phillips' Strange Adventures of Lucy Smith. It is unnecessary to mention in detail the literature produced by avowed theosophists and occultists, some of whose works are very remarkable, while others are positively scientific, such as S. L. MacGregor Mather's Kabbalah Unveiled, and Dr. F. Hartmann's Paracelsus, Magic, White and Black, etc. We have also to note the fact that theosophy has now crossed the Channel, and is making its way into French literature. La France publishes A Strange Romance by C.H. Chinchol, pregnant with theosophy, occultism and mesmerism, and called La Grande Prêtresse, while La Revue Politique et Littéraire, February 19, 1887, et seq., contained over the signature of Th. Benson, a novel called Emancipe, wherein esoteric doctrines and adepts are mentioned in conjunction with the names of well-known theosophists. A sign of the times. Literature, especially in countries free from government censorship, is the public heart and pulse. Besides the glaring fact that were there no demand there would be no supply, current literature is produced only to please, and is therefore evidently the mirror which faithfully reflects the state of the public mind. True, conservative editors, and their submissive correspondents and reporters, still go on slashing occasionally in print the fair faces of mystic spiritualism and theosophy, and some of them are still found, from time to time, indulging in a brutal personal attack. But they do no harm on the whole, except perhaps to their own editorial reputations, as such editors can never be suspected of an exuberance of culture and good taste after certain ungentlemanly personal attacks. They do good on the contrary. For, while the theosophists and spiritualists so attacked, may view the Billingsgate poured upon them in a true Socratian spirit, and console themselves with the knowledge that none of the epithets used can possibly apply to them, on the other hand, too much abuse and vilification generally ends by awakening the public sympathy for the victim, in the right-minded and the impartial, at any rate. In England people seem to like fair play on the whole. It is not Bashibuzuk-like actions, the doughty deeds of those who delight in mutilating the slain and the wounded, that can find sympathy for any great length of time with the public. If, as maintained by our lay enemies and repeated by some naïf and too sanguine missionary organs, spiritualism and theosophy are dead as a doornail, sick. Vide American Christian periodicals, dead and buried, why, in such case, good Christian fathers, not leave the dead at rest till Judgment Day? And if they are not, then editors, the profane as well as the clerical, why should you still fear? Do not show yourselves such cowards if you have the truth on your side. Magna est veritas ea prevalebit, and murder will out, as it always has, sooner or later. Open your columns to free and fearless discussion, and do as the theosophical periodicals have ever done, and as Lucifer is now preparing to do. The bright sun of the morning fears no light. He courts it, and is prepared to publish any inimical contributions, couched, of course, in decent language, however much at variance with his theosophical views. He is determined to give a fair hearing in any and every case, to both contending parties and allow things and thoughts to be judged on their respective merits. For why, or what should one dread when fact and truth are one's only aim? Du choc de opinions jaillit la vérité was said by a French philosopher. If theosophy and spiritualism are no better than gigantic frauds and will-o'-the-wisps of the age, why such expensive crusades against both? And if they are not, why should agnostics and searchers after truth in general, help bigoted and narrow-minded materialists, sectarians and dogmatists to hide our light under a bushel by mere brutal force and usurped authority? It is easy to surprise the good faith of the fair-minded. Still easier to discredit that, which by its intrinsic strangeness, is already unpopular and could hardly be credited in its palmiest days. We welcome no supposition so eagerly as one which accords with and intensifies our own prejudices, says, in Don Gesualdo, a popular author. Therefore, facts become often cunningly concocted frauds. And self-evident, glaring lies are accepted as gospel truths at the first breeze of Don Basilio's calumnia, by those to whose hard-crusted preconceptions such slander is like heavenly dew. But, beloved enemies, the light of Lucifer may, after all, dispel some of the surrounding darkness. The mighty roaring voice of denunciation, so welcome to those whose little spites and hates and mental stagnation in the grasp of the social respectability it panders to, may yet be silenced by the voice of truth, the still small voice, whose destiny it ever was to first preach in the desert. That cold and artificial light which still seems to shine so dazzlingly over the alleged iniquities of professional mediums and the supposed sins of commission and omission of non-professional experimentalists, of free and independent theosophists, may yet be extinguished at the height of all its glory. For it is not quite the perpetual lamp of the alchemist philosopher. Still less is it that light which never shone on sea or land, that ray of divine intuition, the spark which glimmers latent in the spiritual, never-erring perceptions of man and woman, and which is now awakening, for its time is at hand. A few years more, and the Aladdin's lamp, which called forth the ministering genius thereof, who, making 3 salutes to the public, proceeded forthwith to devour mediums and theosophists, like a juggler who swallows swords at a village fair, will get out of order. Its light, over which the anti-theosophists are crowing victory to this day, shall get dim. And then, perhaps, it will be discovered that what was claimed as a direct ray from the source of eternal truth was no better than a penny rushlight, in whose deceitful smoke and soot people got hypnotized, and saw everything upside down. It will be found that the hideous monsters of fraud and imposture had no existence outside the murky and dizzied brains of the Aladdins on their journey of discovery. And that, finally, the good people who listened to them, had been all the time seeing sights and hearing things under unconscious and mutual suggestion. This is a scientific explanation, and requires no black magicians or dugpa at work. Fourth suggestion, as now practiced by the sorcerers of science is, dugpaship itself, per sang. No Eastern adept of the left hand can do more mischief by his infernal art than a grave hypnotizer of the faculty of medicine, a disciple of Charcot, or of any other scientific light of the first magnitude. In Paris, as in St. Petersburg, crimes have been committed under suggestion. Divorces have occurred, and husbands have nearly killed their wives and their supposed correspondents, owing to tricks played on innocent and respectable women, who have thus had their fair name and all their future life blasted forever. A son, under such influence, broke open the desk of an avaricious father, who caught him in the act, and nearly shot him in a fit of rage. One of the keys of occultism is in the hands of science, cold, heartless, materialistic, and crassly ignorant of the other truly psychic side of the phenomenon, hence powerless to draw a line of demarcation between the physiological and the purely spiritual effects of the disease inoculated, and unable to prevent future results and consequences of which it has no knowledge, and over which it has, therefore, no control. We find in the Lotus of September, 1887, the following. A French paper, the Paris, for August 12, contains a long and excellent article by G. Montorgueil, entitled, The Accursed Sciences, from which we extract the following passage, since we are, unfortunately, unable to quote the whole. Some months ago, already, in I forget what case, the question of suggestion was raised and taken account of by the judges. We shall certainly see people in the dock accused of occult malpractices. But how will the prosecution go to work? What arguments will it bring to bear? The crime by suggestion is the ideal of a crime without proof. In such a case the gravest charges will never be more than presumptions, and fugitive presumptions. On what fragile scaffolding of suspicions will the charge rest? No examination, but a moral one, will be possible. We shall have to resign ourselves to hearing the Solicitor General say to the accused, "Accused, it appears from a perquisition made into your brain," etc. Ah, the poor jurymen! It is they who are to be pitied. Taking their task to heart, they already have the greatest difficulty in separating the true from the false, even in rough and ready cases, the facts of which are obvious, all the details of which are tangible and the responsibilities clear. And we are going to ask them on their soul and conscience to decide questions of black magic. Verily their reason will not hold out through the fortnight, it will give way before that and sink into thaumaturgy. We move fast. The strange trials for sorcery will blossom anew, somnambules who were merely grotesque will appear in a tragic light, the coffee grounds, which so far only risked the police court, will hear their sentence at the assizes. The evil eye will figure among criminal offenses. These last years of the XXth century will have seen us step from progress to progress, till we reach at last this judicial enormity, a second Laubardement prosecuting another urbane grandeur. Serious, scientific, and political papers are full of earnest discussions on the subject. A St. Petersburg daily has a long feuilleton on the bearing of hypnotic suggestions upon criminal law. Cases of hypnotism with criminal motives have of late begun to increase in an ever-progressing ratio, it tells its readers. And it is not the only newspaper, nor is Russia the only country where the same tale is told. Careful investigations and researches have been made by distinguished lawyers and medical authorities. Data have been assiduously collected and have revealed that the curious phenomenon, which skeptics have hitherto derided, and young people have included among their evening petit jeu innocence, is a new and terrible danger to state and society. Two facts have now become patent to law and science. That, in the perceptions of the hypnotized subject, the visionary representations called forth by suggestion, become real existing actualities, the subject being, for the moment, the automatic executor of the will of the hypnotizer. And 2. That the great majority of persons experimented upon, is subject to hypnotic suggestion. Thus Liebold found only 60 subjects intractable out of the 700 he experimented upon. And Bernheim, out of 1,014 subjects, failed with only 26. The field for the natural-born Jaduwala, sorcery-mongers, is vast indeed. Evil has acquired a playground on which it may now exercise its sway upon many a generation of unconscious victims. For crimes undreamt of in the waking state, and felonies of the blackest dye, are now invited and encouraged by the new, accursed science. The real perpetrators of these deeds of darkness may now remain forever hidden from the vengeance of human justice. The hand which executes the criminal suggestion is only that of an irresponsible automaton, whose memory preserves no trace of it, and who, moreover, is a witness who can easily be disposed of by compulsory suicide, again under suggestion. What better means than these could be offered to the fiends of lust and revenge, to those dark powers, called human passions, ever on the lookout to break the universal commandment, thou shalt not steal, nor murder, nor lust after thy neighbor's wife? Liebold suggested to a young girl that she should poison herself with prussic acid, and she swallowed the supposed drug without one moment's hesitation. Dr. Liguois suggested to a young woman that she owed him 5,000 francs, and the subject forthwith signed a check for the amount. Bernheim suggested to another hysterical girl a long and complicated vision with regard to a criminal case. 2 days after, although the hypnotizer had not exercised any new pressure upon her in the interim, she repeated distinctly the whole suggested story to a lawyer sent to her for the purpose. Had her evidence been seriously accepted, it would have brought the accused to the guillotine. These cases present two dark and terrible aspects. From the moral standpoint, such processes and suggestions leave an indelible stain upon the purity of the subject's nature. Even the innocent mind of a 10-year-old child can thus be inoculated with vice, the poison germ of which will develop in his subsequent life. On the judicial aspect it is needless to enter in great detail. Suffice to say that it is this characteristic feature of the hypnotic state, the absolute surrender of will and self-consciousness to the hypnotizer, which possesses such importance, from its bearing upon crime, in the eyes of legal authorities. For if the hypnotizer has the subject entirely at his beck and call, so that he can cause him to commit any crime, acting, so to say, invisibly within him, then what are not the terrible, judicial mistakes, to be expected? What wonder then, that the jurisprudence of one country after the other has taken alarm, and is devising, one after the other, measures for repressing the exercise of hypnotism. In Denmark it has just been forbidden. Scientists have experimented upon sensitives with so much success that a hypnotized victim has been jeered and hooted through the streets on his way to commit a crime, which he would have completed unconsciously, had not the victim been warned beforehand by the hypnotizer. In Brussels a recent and sad case is well known to all. A young girl of good family was seduced while in a hypnotized state by a man who had first subjected her to his influence at a social gathering. She only realized her condition a few months later, when her relatives, who divined the criminal, forced her seducer to make the only possible reparation, that of marrying his victim. The French Academy has just been debating the question, how far a hypnotized subject, from a mere victim, can become a regular tool of crime. Of course, no jurist or legislator can remain indifferent to this question. And it was averred that the crimes committed under suggestion are so unprecedented that some of them can hardly be brought within the scope of the law. Hence the prudent legal prohibition, just adopted in France, which enacts that no person, save those legally qualified to exercise the medical profession, shall hypnotize any other person. Even the physician who enjoys such legal right is permitted to hypnotize a person only in the presence of another qualified medical man, and with the written permission of the subject. Public séances of hypnotism are forbidden, and they are strictly confined to medical cliniques and laboratories. Those who break this law are liable to a heavy fine and imprisonment. But the keynote has been struck, and many are the ways in which this black art may be used, laws notwithstanding. That it will be so used, the vile passions inherent in human nature are sufficient guarantee. Many and strange will be the romances yet enacted, for truth is often stranger than fiction, and what is thought fiction is still more often truth. No wonder then that occult literature is growing with every day. Occultism and sorcery are in the air, with no true philosophical knowledge to guide the experimenters and thus check evil results. Works of fiction, the various novels and romances are called fiction, in the arrangement of their characters and the adventures of their heroes and heroines, admitted. Not so, as to the facts presented. These are no fictions, but true presentiments of what lies in the bosom of the future, and much of which is already born, nay corroborated by scientific experiments. Sign of the times. Close of a psychic cycle. The time for phenomena with, or through mediums, whether professional or otherwise, is gone by. It was the early season of the blossoming, of the era mentioned even in the Bible 11. The tree of occultism is now preparing for fruiting, and the spirit of the occult is awakening in the blood of the new generations. If the old men only dream dreams, the young ones see already visions 12, and record them in novels and works of fiction. Woe to the ignorant and the unprepared, and those who listen to the sirens of materialistic science. For indeed, many will be the unconscious crimes committed, and many will be the victims who will innocently suffer death by hanging and decapitation at the hands of the righteous judges and the too innocent jurymen. Both alike ignorant of the fiendish power of suggestion. Psychic and noetic action. I made man just and right. Sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all ethereal powers. And spirits, both them who stood and them who failed. Truly, they stood who stood, and fell who fell, Milton. The assumption that the mind is a real being, which can be acted upon by the brain, and which can act on the body through the brain, is the only one compatible with all the facts of experience. George T. Ladd, in the Elements of Physiological Psychology. I. A new influence, a breath, a sound, as of a rushing mighty wind, has suddenly swept over a few theosophical heads. An idea, vague at first, grew in time into a very definite form, and now seems to be working very busily in the minds of some of our members. It is this: if we would make converts, the few ex-occult teachings, which are destined to see the light of publicity, should be made, henceforward, more subservient to, if not entirely at one with modern science. It is urged that the so-called esoteric 13, or late esoteric, cosmogony, anthropology, ethnology, geology, psychology and, foremost of all, metaphysics, having been adapted into making obeisance to modern, hence materialistic, thought, should never henceforth be allowed to contradict, not openly, at all events, scientific philosophy. The latter, we suppose, means the fundamental and accepted views of the great German schools, or of Mr. Herbert Spencer and some other English stars of lesser magnitude. And not only these, but also the deductions that may be drawn from them by their more or less instructed disciples. A large undertaking this, truly. And one, moreover, in perfect conformity with the policy of the medieval casuists, who distorted truth and even suppressed it, if it clashed with divine revelation. Useless to say that we decline the compromise. It is quite possible, nay, probable and almost unavoidable, that the mistakes made, in the rendering of such abstruse metaphysical tenets as those contained in Eastern occultism, should be frequent and often important. But then all such have to be traced back to the interpreters, not to the system itself. They have to be corrected on the authority of the same doctrine, checked by the teachings grown on the rich and steady soil of Gupta Vidya, not by the speculations that blossom forth today. To die tomorrow, on the shifting sands of modern scientific guesswork, especially in all that relates to psychology and mental phenomena. Holding to our motto, there is no religion higher than truth, we refuse most decidedly to pander to physical science. Yet, we may say this, if the so-called exact sciences limited their activity only to the physical realm of nature, if they concerned themselves strictly with surgery, chemistry, up to its legitimate boundaries, and with physiology, so far as the latter relates to the structure of our corporeal frame, then the occultists would be the first to seek help in modern sciences, however many their blunders and mistakes. But once that overstepping material nature the physiologists of animalistic 14 school pretend to meddle with, and deliver ex cathedra dicta on, the higher functions and phenomena of the mind, saying that a careful analysis brings them to a firm conviction that no more than the animal is man a free agent, far less a responsible one, then the occultist has a far greater right than the average modern idealist to protest. And the occultist asserts that no materialist, a prejudiced and one-sided witness at best, can claim any authority in the question of mental physiology, or that which is now called by him the physiology of the soul. No such noun can be applied to the word soul, unless, indeed, by soul only the lower, psychic mind is meant, or that which develops in man, proportionally with the perfection of his brain, into intellect, and in the animal into a higher instinct. But since the great Charles Darwin taught that our ideas are animal motions of the organ of sense, everything becomes possible to the modern physiologist. Thus, to the great distress of our scientifically inclined fellows, it is once more Lucifer's duty to show how far we are at loggerheads with exact science, or shall we say, how far the conclusions of that science are drifting away from truth and fact. By science, we mean, of course, the majority of the men of science. The best minority, we are happy to say, is on our side, at least as far as free will in man and the immateriality of the mind are concerned. The study of the physiology of the soul, of the will in man and of his higher consciousness from the standpoint of genius and its manifesting faculties, can never be summarized into a system of general ideas represented by brief formulae. No more than the psychology of material nature can have its manifold mysteries solved by the mere analysis of its physical phenomena. There is no special organ of will, any more than there is a physical basis for the activities of self-consciousness. If the question is pressed as to the physical basis for the activities of self-consciousness, no answer can be given or suggested. From its very nature, that marvelous verifying actus of mind in which it recognizes the states as its own, can have no analogous or corresponding material substratum. It is impossible to specify any physiological process representing this unifying actus. It is even impossible to imagine how the description of any such process could be brought into intelligible relation with this unique mental power. 15. Thus, the whole conclave of psychophysiologists may be challenged to correctly define consciousness, and they are sure to fail, because self-consciousness belongs alone to man and proceeds from the self, the higher manas only. Whereas the psychic element, or kama manas, 16 is common to both the animal and the human being, the far higher degree of its development in the latter resting merely on the greater perfection and sensitiveness of his cerebral cells, no physiologist, not even the cleverest, will ever be able to solve the mystery of the human mind, in its highest spiritual manifestation, or in its dual aspect of the psychic and the noetic, or the manasic. 17 or even to comprehend the intricacies of the former on the purely material plane, unless he knows something of, and is prepared to admit the presence of this dual element. This means that he would have to admit a lower, animal, and a higher, or divine, mind in man, or what is known in occultism as the personal and the impersonal egos. For, between the psychic and the noetic, between the personality and the individuality, there exists the same abyss as between a Jack the Ripper and a holy Buddha. Unless the physiologist accepts all this, we say, he will ever be led into a quagmire. We intend to prove it. As all know, the great majority of our learned didymi reject the idea of free will. Now this question is a problem that has occupied the minds of thinkers for ages, every school of thought having taken it up in turn and left it as far from solution as ever. And yet, placed as it is in the foremost ranks of philosophical quandaries, the modern psychophysiologists claim in the coolest and most bumptious way to have cut the Gordian knot forever. For them the feeling of personal free agency is an error, an illusion, the collective hallucination of mankind. This conviction starts from the principle that no mental activity is possible without a brain, and that there can be no brain without a body. As the latter is, moreover, subject to the general laws of a material world where all is based on necessity, and where there is no spontaneity, our modern psychophysiologist has nolens volens to repudiate any self-spontaneity in human action. Here we have, for instance, a Lausanne professor of physiology, A. Herzen, to whom the claim of free will in man appears as the most unscientific absurdity. Says this oracle: in the boundless physical and chemical laboratory that surrounds man, organic life represents quite an unimportant group of phenomena. And amongst the latter, the place occupied by life having reached to the stage of consciousness, is so minute that it is absurd to exclude man from the sphere of action of a general law, in order to allow in him the existence of a subjective spontaneity or a free will standing outside of that law, psychophysiologie générale. For the occultist who knows the difference between the psychic and the noetic elements in man, this is pure trash, notwithstanding its sound scientific basis. For when the author puts the question, if psychic phenomena do not represent the results of an action of a molecular character, whither then does motion disappear after reaching the sensory centers? We answer that we never denied the fact. But what has this to do with a free will? That every phenomenon in the visible universe has its genesis in motion, is an old axiom in occultism. Nor do we doubt that the psychophysiologist would place himself at loggerheads with the whole conclave of exact scientists were he to allow the idea that at a given moment a whole series of physical phenomena may disappear in the vacuum. Therefore, when the author of the work cited maintains that the said force does not disappear upon reaching the highest nervous centers, but that it is forthwith transformed into another series, viz. that of psychic manifestations, into thought, feeling, and consciousness, just as this same psychic force when applied to produce some work of a physical, e.g. muscular, character gets transformed into the latter, occultism supports him, for it is the first to say that all psychic activity, from its lowest to its highest manifestations, is nothing but motion. Yes, it is motion. But not all molecular motion, as the writer means us to infer. Motion as the great breath, vide Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, Sub Voce, ergo, sound, at the same time, is the substratum of cosmic motion. It is beginningless and endless, the one eternal life, the basis and genesis of the subjective and the objective universe, for life, or beingness, is the fons edi origo of existence or being. But molecular motion is the lowest and most material of its finite manifestations. And if the general law of the conservation of energy leads modern science to the conclusion that psychic activity only represents a special form of motion, this same law, guiding the occultists, leads them also to the same conviction, and to something else besides, which psychophysiology leaves entirely out of all consideration. If the latter has discovered only in this century that psychic, we say even spiritual, action is subject to the same general and immutable laws of motion as any other phenomenon manifested in the objective realm of cosmos, and that in both the organic and the inorganic worlds every manifestation, whether conscious or unconscious, represents but the result of a collectivity of causes, then in occult philosophy this represents merely the A, B, C, of its science. All the world is the svara. Svara is the spirit itself, the one life or motion, say the old books of Hindu occult philosophy. The proper translation of the word svara is the current of the life wave, says the author of Nature's Finer Forces. 18. And he goes on to explain. It is that wavy motion which is the cause of the evolution of cosmic undifferentiated matter into the differentiated universe. From whence does this motion come? This motion is the spirit itself. The word Atma, universal soul, used in the book, Vide Infra, itself carries the idea of eternal motion, coming as it does from the root, at, or eternal motion. And it may be significantly remarked, that the root at is connected with, is in fact simply another form of, the roots ah, breath, and as, being. All these roots have for their origin the sound produced by the breath of animals, living beings. The primeval current of the life wave is then the same which assumes in man the form of inspiratory and expiratory motion of the lungs, and this is the all-pervading source of the evolution and involution of the universe. So much about motion and the conservation of energy, from old books on magic written and taught ages before the birth of inductive and exact modern science. For what does the latter say more than these books in speaking, for instance, about animal mechanism, when it says, "From the visible atom to the celestial body lost in space, everything is subject to motion. Kept at a definite distance one from the other, in proportion to the motion which animates them, the molecules present constant relations, which they lose only by the addition or the subtraction of a certain quantity of motion." 19. But occultism says more than this. While making of motion on the material plane and of the conservation of energy, two fundamental laws, or rather two aspects of the same omnipresent law, svara. It denies point-blank that these have anything to do with the free will of man, which belongs to quite a different plane. The author of Psychophysiologie Générale, treating of his discovery that psychic action is but motion, and the result of a collectivity of causes, remarks that as it is so, there cannot be any further discussion upon spontaneity, in the sense of any native internal proneness created by the human organism. And adds that the above puts an end to all claim for free will. The occultist denies the conclusion. The actual fact of man's psychic, we say manasic or noetic, individuality is a sufficient warrant against the assumption. For in the case of this conclusion being correct, or being indeed, as the author expresses it, the collective hallucination of the whole mankind throughout the ages, there would be an end also to psychic individuality. Now by psychic individuality we mean that self-determining power which enables man to override circumstances. Place half a dozen animals of the same species under the same circumstances, and their actions, while not identical, will be closely similar. Place half a dozen men under the same circumstances and their actions will be as different as their characters, i.e., their psychic individuality. But if instead of psychic, we call it the higher self-conscious will, then having been shown by the science of psychophysiology itself that will has no special organ, how will the materialists connect it with molecular motion at all? As Professor George T. Ladd says, the phenomena of human consciousness must be regarded as activities of some other form of real being than the moving molecules of the brain. They require a subject or ground which is in its nature unlike the phosphorized fats of the central masses, the aggregated nerve fibers of nerve cells of the cerebral cortex. This real being thus manifested immediately to itself in the phenomena of consciousness, and indirectly to others through the bodily changes, is the mind, manas. To it the mental phenomena are to be attributed as showing what it is by what it does. The so-called mental faculties are only the modes of the behavior in consciousness of this real being. We actually find, by the only method available, that this real being called mind believes in certain perpetually recurring modes, therefore, we attribute to it certain faculties. Mental faculties are not entities that have an existence of themselves. They are the modes of the behavior in consciousness of the mind. And the very nature of the classifying acts which lead to their being distinguished, is explicable only upon the assumption that a real being called mind exists, and is to be distinguished from the real being known as the physical molecules of the brain's nervous mass. 20. And having shown that we have to regard consciousness as a unit, another occult proposition, the author adds. We conclude, then, from the previous considerations, the subject of all the states of consciousness is a real unit being, called mind, which is of non-material nature, and acts and develops according to laws of its own, but is specially correlated with certain material molecules and masses forming the substance of the brain. 21. This mind is manas, or rather its lower reflection, which whenever it disconnects itself, for the time being, with kama, becomes the guide of the highest mental faculties, and is the organ of the free will in physical man. Therefore, this assumption of the newest psychophysiology is uncalled for, and the apparent impossibility of reconciling the existence of free will with the law of the conservation of energy is a pure fallacy. This was well shown in the scientific letters of P in a criticism of the work. But to prove it finally and set the whole question definitely at rest, does not even require so high an interference, high for us, at any rate, as the occult laws, but simply a little common sense. Let us analyze the question dispassionately. It is postulated by one man, presumably a scientist, that because psychic action is found subject to the general and immutable laws of motion, there is, therefore, no free will in man. The analytical method of exact sciences has demonstrated it, and materialistic scientists have decreed to pass the resolution that the fact should be so accepted by their followers. But there are other and far greater scientists who thought differently. For instance, Sir William Lawrence, the eminent surgeon, declared in his lectures 22 that the philosophical doctrine of the soul, and its separate existence, has nothing to do with this physiological question, but rests on a species of proof altogether different. These sublime dogmas could never have been brought to light by the labors of the anatomist and physiologist. An immaterial and spiritual being could not have been discovered amid the blood and filth of the dissecting room. Now, let us examine on the testimony of the materialist how this universal solvent called the analytical method is applied in this special case. The author of the Psychophysiology decomposes psychic activity into its compound elements, traces them back to motion, and, failing to find in them the slightest trace of free will or spontaneity, jumps at the conclusion that the latter have no existence in general. Nor are they to be found in that psychic activity which he has just decomposed. Are not the fallacy and error of such an unscientific proceeding self-evident, asks his critic. And then argues very correctly that, at this rate, and starting from the standpoint of this analytical method, one would have an equal right to deny every phenomenon in nature from first to last. For, do not sound and light, heat and electricity, like all other chemical processes, once decomposed into their respective elements, lead the experimenter back to the same motion, wherein all the peculiarities of the given elements disappear, leaving behind them only the vibrations of molecules? But does it necessarily follow that for all that, heat, light, electricity, are but illusions instead of the actual manifestations of the peculiarities of our real world? Such peculiarities are not, of course, to be found in compound elements, simply because we cannot expect that a part should contain, from first to last, the properties of the whole. What should we say of a chemist, who, having decomposed water into its compounds, hydrogen and oxygen, without finding in them the special characteristics of water, would maintain that such did not exist at all, nor could they be found in water? What of an antiquary who, upon examining distributed type and finding no sense in every separate letter, should assert that there was no such thing as sense to be found in any printed document? And does not the author of Psychophysiology act just in this way when he denies the existence of free will or self-spontaneity in man, on the grounds that this distinctive faculty of the highest psychic activity is absent from those compound elements which he has analyzed? Most undeniably, no separate piece of brick, of wood, or iron, each of which has once been a part of a building now in ruins, can be expected to preserve the smallest trace of the architecture of that building, in the hands of the chemist. At any rate, though it would in those of a psychometer, a faculty by the by, which demonstrates far more powerfully the law of the conservation of energy than any physical science does, and shows it acting as much in the subjective or psychic worlds as in the objective and material planes. The genesis of sound, on this plane, has to be traced back to the same motion, and the same correlation of forces is at play during the phenomenon as in the case of every other manifestation. Shall the physicist, then, who decomposes sound into its compound element of vibrations and fails to find in them any harmony or special melody, deny the existence of the latter? And does not this prove that the analytical method, having to deal exclusively with the elements, and nothing to do with their combinations, leads the physicist to talk very glibly about motion, vibration, and what not, and to make him entirely lose sight of the harmony produced by certain combinations of that motion or the harmony of vibrations? Criticism, then, is right in accusing materialistic psychophysiology of neglecting these all-important distinctions, in maintaining that if a careful observation of facts is a duty in the simplest physical phenomena, how much more should it be so when applied to such complex and important questions as psychic force and faculties? And yet in most cases all such essential differences are overlooked, and the analytical method is applied in a most arbitrary and prejudiced way. What wonder, then, if, in carrying back psychic action to its basic elements of motion, the psychophysiologist depriving it during the process of all its essential characteristics, should destroy it, and having destroyed it. It only stands to reason that he is unable to find that which exists in it no longer. He forgets, in short, or rather purposely ignores the fact, that though, like all other phenomena on the material plane, psychic manifestations must be related in their final analysis to the world of vibration, sound being the substratum of universal akasa, yet, in their origin, they belong to a different and a higher world of harmony. Elpe has a few severe sentences against the assumptions of those he calls physicobiologists, which are worthy of note. Unconscious of their error, the psychophysiologists identify the compound elements of psychic activity with that activity itself, hence the conclusion from the standpoint of the analytical method, that the highest distinctive speciality of the human soul, free will, spontaneity, is an illusion, and no psychic reality. But as we have just shown, such identification not only has nothing in common with exact science, but is simply impermissible, as it clashes with all the fundamental laws of logic. In consequence of which all these so-called physico-biological deductions emanating from the said identification vanish into thin air. Thus to trace psychic action primarily to motion, means in no way to prove the illusion of free will. And, as in the case of water, whose specific qualities cannot be deprived of their reality although they are not to be found in its compound gases, so with regard to the specific property of psychic action, its spontaneity cannot be refused to psychic reality. Though this property is not contained in those finite elements into which the psychophysiologist dismembers the activity in question under his mental scalpel. This method is a distinctive feature of modern science in its endeavor to satisfy inquiry into the nature of the objects of its investigation by a detailed description of their development, says G. T. Ladd. And the author of the Elements of Physiological Psychology adds, the universal process of becoming has been almost personified and deified so as to make it the true ground of all finite and concrete existence. The attempt is made to refer all the so-called development of the mind to the evolution of the substance of the brain, under purely physical and mechanical causes. This attempt, then, denies that any real unit being called the mind needs to be assumed as undergoing a process of development according to laws of its own. On the other hand, all attempts to account for the orderly increase in complexity and comprehensiveness of the mental phenomena by tracing the physical evolution of the brain are wholly unsatisfactory to many minds. We have no hesitation in classing ourselves among this number. Those facts of experience which show a correspondence in the order of the development of the body in the mind, and even a certain necessary dependence of the latter upon the former, are, of course, to be admitted. But they are equally compatible with another view of the mind's development. This other view has the additional advantage that it makes room for many other facts of experience which are very difficult of reconciliation with any materialistic theory. On the whole, the history of each individual's experiences is such as requires the assumption that a real unit being, a mind, is undergoing a process of development, in relation to the changing condition or evolution of the brain. And yet in accordance with a nature and laws of its own, p. 616. How closely this last assumption of science approaches the teachings of the occult philosophy will be shown in Part 2 of this article. Meanwhile, we may close with an answer to the latest materialistic fallacy, which may be summarized in a few words. As every psychic action has for its substratum the nervous elements whose existence it postulates, and outside which it cannot act. As the activity of the nervous elements is only molecular motion, there is therefore no need to invent a special and psychic force for the explanation of our brain work. Free will would force science to postulate an invisible free willer, a creator of that special force. We agree, not the slightest need, of a creator of that special or any other force. Nor has anyone ever claimed such an absurdity. But between creating and guiding, there is a difference, and the latter implies in no way any creation of the energy of motion, or, indeed, of any special energy. Psychic mind, in contradistinction to manasic or noetic mind, only transforms this energy of the unit being, according to a nature and laws of its own, to use Ladd's felicitous expression. The unit being creates nothing but only causes a natural correlation in accordance with both the psychical laws and laws of its own. Having to use the force, it guides its direction, choosing the paths along which it will proceed, and stimulating it to action. And, as its activity is sui generis, and independent, it carries this energy from this world of disharmony into its own sphere of harmony. Were it not independent, it could not do so. As it is, the freedom of man's will is beyond doubt or cavil. Therefore, as already observed, there is no question of creation, but simply of guidance. Because the sailor at the wheel does not create the steam in the engine, shall we say that he does not direct the vessel? And, because we refuse to accept the fallacies of some psychophysiologists as the last word of science, do we furnish thereby a new proof that free will is an hallucination? We deride the animalistic idea. How far more scientific and logical, besides being as poetical as it is grand, is the teaching in the Kathopanishad, which, in a beautiful and descriptive metaphor, says that, the senses are the horses, body is the chariot. Mind, kama-manas, is the reins, and intellect, or free will, the charioteer. Verily, there is more exact science in the less important of the Upanishads, composed thousands of years ago, than in all the materialistic ravings of modern physicobiology and psychophysiology put together. 2. The knowledge of the past, present, and future, is embodied in Kshetrajna, the self. Occult axioms. Having explained in what particulars, and why, as occultists, we disagree with materialistic physiological psychology, we may now proceed to point out the difference between psychic and noetic mental functions. The noetic not being recognized by official science. Moreover, we, theosophists, understand the terms psychic and psychism somewhat differently from the average public, science, and even theology, the latter giving it a significance which both science and theosophy reject. And the public in general remaining with a very hazy conception of what is really meant by the terms. For many, there is little, if any, difference between psychic and psychological, both words relating in some way to the human soul. Some modern metaphysicians have wisely agreed to disconnect the word mind, pneuma, from soul, psyche, the one being the rational, spiritual part, the other, psyche, the living principle in man, the breath that animates him, from anima, soul. Yet, if this is so, how in this case refuse a soul to animals? These are, no less than man, informed with the same principle of sentient life, the nephesh of the second chapter of Genesis. The soul is by no means the mind, nor can an idiot, bereft of the latter, be called a soulless being. To describe, as the physiologists do, the human soul in its relations to senses and appetites, desires and passions, common to man and the brute, and then endow it with godlike intellect. With spiritual and rational faculties which can take their source but in a supersensible world, is to throw forever the veil of an impenetrable mystery over the subject. Yet in modern science, psychology, and psychism relate only to conditions of the nervous system, mental phenomena being traced solely to molecular action. The higher noetic character of the mind principle is entirely ignored, and even rejected, as a superstition, by both physiologists and psychologists. Psychology, in fact, has become a synonym in many cases for the science of psychiatry. Therefore, students of theosophy being compelled to differ from all these, have adopted the doctrine that underlies the time-honored philosophies of the East. What it is, may be found further on. To better understand the foregoing arguments and those which follow, the reader is asked to turn to the editorial in the September Lucifer, The Dual Aspect of Wisdom, p. 3, and acquaint himself with the double aspect of that which is termed by St. James in his third epistle at once, the devilish, terrestrial wisdom and the wisdom from above. In another editorial, Cosmic Mind, April, 1890, it is also stated, that the ancient Hindus endowed every cell in the human body with consciousness, giving each the name of a god or goddess. Speaking of atoms in the name of science and philosophy, Professor Ladd calls them in his work supersensible beings. Occultism regards every atom 23 as an independent entity, and every cell as a conscious unit. It explains that no sooner do such atoms group to form cells, than the latter become endowed with consciousness, each of its own kind, and with free will to act within the limits of law. Nor are we entirely deprived of scientific evidence for such statements as the two above named editorials well prove. More than one learned physiologist of the golden minority, in our own day, moreover, is rapidly coming to the conviction that memory has no seat, no special organ of its own in the human brain, but that it has seats in every organ of the body. No good ground exists for speaking of any special organ, or seat of memory, writes Professor G. T. Ladd. 24. Every organ, indeed, every area, and every limit of the nervous system has its own memory, Elements of Physiological Psychology, p. 553. The seat of memory, then, is assuredly neither here nor there, but everywhere throughout the human body. To locate its organ in the brain is to limit and dwarf the universal mind and its countless rays, the Manasaputra, which inform every rational mortal. As we write for theosophists, first of all, we care little for the psychophobian prejudices of the materialists who may read this and sniff contemptuously at the mention of universal mind and the higher noetic souls of men. But, what is memory, we ask? Both presentation of sense and image of memory are transitory phases of consciousness, we are answered. But what is consciousness itself? We ask again. We cannot define consciousness, Professor Ladd tells us. Ibid, thus, that which we are asked to do by physiological psychology is, to content ourselves with controverting the various states of consciousness by other people's private and unverifiable hypotheses. And this, on questions of cerebral physiology where experts and novices are alike ignorant, to use the pointed remark of the said author. Hypothesis for hypothesis, then, we may as well hold to the teachings of our seers, as to the conjectures of those who deny both such seers and their wisdom. The more so, as we are told by the same honest man of science, that if metaphysics and ethics cannot properly dictate their facts and conclusions to the science of physiological psychology. In turn this science cannot properly dictate to metaphysics and ethics the conclusions which they shall draw from facts of consciousness, by giving out its myths and fables in the garb of well-ascertained history of the cerebral processes, page 544. Now, since the metaphysics of occult physiology and psychology postulate within mortal man an immortal entity, divine mind, or nous, whose pale and too often distorted reflection is that which we call mind and intellect in men, virtually an entity apart from the former during the period of incarnation, we say that the two sources of memory are in these two principles. These two we distinguish as the higher manas, mind or ego, and the kama manas, i.e. the rational, but earthly or physical intellect of man, encased in, and bound by, matter, therefore subject to the influence of the latter, the all-conscious self, that which reincarnates periodically, verily the Word made flesh. And which is always the same, while its reflected, double, changing with every new incarnation and personality, is, therefore, conscious but for a life period. The latter principle is the lower self, or that, which manifesting through our organic system, acting on this plane of illusion, imagines itself the ego sum, and thus falls into what Buddhist philosophy brands as the heresy of separateness. The former, we term individuality, the latter personality. From the first proceeds all the noetic element, from the second, the psychic, i.e. terrestrial wisdom, at best, as it is influenced by all the chaotic stimuli of the human or rather animal passions of the living body. The higher ego cannot act directly on the body. As its consciousness belongs to quite another plane and planes of ideation, the lower self does, and its action and behavior depend on its free will and choice as to whether it will gravitate more towards its parent, the Father in heaven, or the animal, which it informs. The man of flesh. The higher ego, as part of the essence of the universal mind, is unconditionally omniscient on its own plane, and only potentially so in our terrestrial sphere, as it has to act solely through its alter ego, the personal self. Now, although the former is the vehicle of all knowledge of the past, the present, and the future, and although it is from this fountainhead that its double catches occasional glimpses of that which is beyond the senses of man, and transmits them to certain brain cells, unknown to science in their function, thus making of man a seer, a soothsayer, and a prophet. Yet the memory of bygone events, especially of the earthy, has its seat in the personal ego alone. No memory of a purely daily life function, of a physical, egotistical, or of a lower mental nature, such as, e.g., eating and drinking, enjoying personal sensual pleasures, transacting business to the detriment of one's neighbor, etc., etc., has aught to do with the higher mind or ego. Nor has it any direct dealings on this physical plane with either our brain or our heart, for these two are the organs of a power higher than the personality, but only with our passional organs, such as the liver, the stomach, the spleen, etc. Thus it only stands to reason that the memory of such like events must be first awakened in that organ which was the first to induce the action remembered afterwards, and conveyed it to our sense thought, which is entirely distinct from the supersensuous thought. It is only the higher forms of the latter, the superconscious mental experience, that can correlate with the cerebral and cardiac centers. The memories of physical and selfish, or personal, deeds, on the other hand, together with the mental experiences of a terrestrial nature, and of earthly biological functions, can, of necessity, only be correlated with the molecular constitution of various chemic organs, and the dynamical associations of the elements of the nervous system in each particular organ. Therefore, when Professor Ladd, after showing that every element of the nervous system has a memory of its own, adds, this view belongs to the very essence of every theory which considers conscious mental reproduction as only one form or phase of the biological fact of organic memory, he must include among such theories the occult teaching. For no occultist could express such teaching more correctly than the professor, who says, in winding up his argument, we might properly speak, then, of the memory of the end organ of vision or of hearing, of the memory of the spinal cord and of the different so-called centers of reflex action belonging to the cords of the memory of the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, etc. This is the essence of occult teaching, even in the Tantra works. Indeed, every organ in our body has its own memory. For if it is endowed with a consciousness of its own kind, every cell must of necessity have also a memory of its own kind, as likewise its own psychic and noetic action. Responding to the touch of both a physical and a metaphysical force, the impulse given by the psychic or psychomolecular force will act from without within, while that of the noetic, shall we call it spiritual dynamical force, works from within without. For, as our body is the covering of the inner principles, soul, mind, life, etc., so the molecule or the cell is the body in which dwell its principles, the, to our sense and comprehension, immaterial atoms which compose that cell. The cell's activity and behavior are determined by its being propelled either inwardly or outwardly, by the noetic or the psychic force, the former having no relation to the physical cells proper. Therefore, while the latter act under the unavoidable law of the conservation and correlation of physical energy, the atoms, being psychospiritual, not physical units, act under laws of their own, just as Professor Ladd's unit being, which is our mind-ego, does, in his very philosophical and scientific hypothesis. Every human organ and each cell in the latter has a keyboard of its own, like that of a piano, only that it registers and emits sensations instead of sounds. Every key contains the potentiality of good or bad, of producing harmony or disharmony. This depends on the impulse given and the combinations produced, and the force of the touch of the artist at work, a double-faced unity, indeed. And it is the action of this or the other face of the unity that determines the nature and the dynamical character of the manifested phenomena as a resulting action, and this whether they be physical or mental. For the whole life of man is guided by this double-faced entity. If the impulse comes from the wisdom above, the force applied being noetic or spiritual, the results will be actions worthy of the divine propeller. If from the terrestrial, devilish wisdom, psychic power, man's activities will be selfish, based solely on the exigencies of his physical, hence animal, nature. The above may sound to the average reader as pure nonsense. But every theosophist must understand when told that there are manasic as well as kamic organs in him, although the cells of his body answer to both physical and spiritual impulses. Verily that body, so desecrated by materialism and man himself, is the temple of the Holy Grail, the adytum of the grandest, nay, of all, the mysteries of nature in our solar universe. That body is an Aeolian harp, chorded with two sets of strings, one made of pure silver, the other of catgut. When the breath from the divine fiat brushes softly over the former, man becomes like unto his God, but the other set feels it not. It needs the breeze of a strong terrestrial wind, impregnated with animal effluvia, to set its animal chords vibrating. It is the function of the physical, lower mind to act upon the physical organs and their cells. But it is the higher mind alone which can influence the atoms interacting in these cells, which interaction is alone capable of exciting the brain, via the spinal center cord, to a mental representation of spiritual ideas far beyond any objects on this material plane. The phenomena of divine consciousness have to be regarded as activities of our mind on another and a higher plane, working through something less substantial than the moving molecules of the brain. They cannot be explained as the simple resultant of the cerebral physiological processes, as indeed the latter only condition them or give them a final form for purposes of concrete manifestation. Occultism teaches that the liver and the spleen cells are the most subservient to the action of our personal mind, the heart being the organ par excellence through which the higher ego acts, through the lower self. Nor can the visions or memory of purely terrestrial events be transmitted directly through the mental perceptions in the brain, the direct recipient of the impressions of the heart. All such recollections have to be first stimulated by and awakened in the organs which were the originators, as already stated, of the various causes that led to the results, or, the direct recipients and participators of the latter. In other words, if what is called association of ideas has much to do with the awakening of memory, the mutual interaction and consistent interrelation between the personal, mind entity, and the organ of the human body have far more so. A hungry stomach evokes the vision of a past banquet, because its action is reflected and repeated in the personal mind. But even before the memory of the personal self radiates the vision from the tablets wherein are stored the experiences of one's daily life, even to the minutest details, the memory of the stomach has already evoked the same. And so with all the organs of the body. It is they which originate according to their animal needs and desires the electrovital sparks that illuminate the field of consciousness in the lower ego. And it is these sparks which in their turn awaken to function the reminiscences in it. The whole human body is, as said, a vast sounding board, in which each cell bears a long record of impressions connected with its parent organ, and each cell has a memory and a consciousness of its kind, or call it instinct if you will. These impressions are, according to the nature of the organ, physical, psychic, or mental, as they relate to this or another plane. They may be called states of consciousness only for the want of a better expression, as there are states of instinctual, mental, and purely abstract, or spiritual consciousness. If we trace all such psychic actions to brain work, it is only because in that mansion called the human body the brain is the front door, and the only one which opens out into space. All the others are inner doors, openings in the private building, through which travel incessantly the transmitting agents of memory and sensation. The clearness, the vividness, and intensity of these depend on the state of health and the organic soundness of the transmitters. But their reality, in the sense of trueness or correctness, is due to the principle they originate from, and the preponderance in the lower manas of the noetic or the phrenic, kamic, terrestrial, element. For, as occultism teaches, if the higher mind entity, the permanent and the immortal, is of the divine homogeneous essence of Alaya Akasa, 25 or Mahat, its reflection, the personal mind, is, as a temporary principle, of the substance of the astral light. As a pure ray of the sun of the universal mind, it could perform no functions in the body, and would remain powerless over the turbulent organs of matter. Thus, while its inner constitution is manasic, its body, or rather functioning essence, is heterogeneous, and leavened with the astral light, the lowest element of ether. It is a part of the mission of the manasic ray, to get gradually rid of the blind, deceptive element which, though it makes of it an active spiritual entity on this plane, still brings it into so close contact with matter as to entirely becloud its divine nature and stultify its intuitions. This leads us to see the difference between the pure noetic and the terrestrial psychic visions of seership and mediumship. The former can be obtained by one of two means: a, on the condition of paralyzing at will the memory and the instinctual, independent action of all the material organs and even cells in the body of flesh, an act which, once that the light of the higher ego has consumed and subjected forever the passional nature of the personal, lower ego, is easy, but requires an adept. And, b, of being a reincarnation of one, who, in a previous birth, had attained through extreme purity of life and efforts in the right direction almost to a yogi state of holiness and saintship. There is also a third possibility of reaching in mystic visions the plane of the higher manas. But it is only occasional and does not depend on the will of the seer, but on the extreme weakness and exhaustion of the material body through illness and suffering. The seeress of Prevorst was an instance of the latter case. And Jacob Boehm of our second category. In all other cases of abnormal seership, of so-called clairaudience, clairvoyance and trances, it is simply mediumship. Now what is a medium? The term medium, when not applied simply to things and objects, is supposed to be a person through whom the action of another person or being is either manifested or transmitted. Spiritualists believing in communications with disembodied spirits, and that these can manifest through, or impress sensitives to transmit, messages from them, regard mediumship as a blessing and a great privilege. We theosophists, on the other hand, who do not believe in the communion of spirits as spiritualists do, regard the gift as one of the most dangerous of abnormal nervous diseases. A medium is simply one in whose personal ego, or terrestrial mind, psyche, the percentage of astral light so preponderates as to impregnate with it their whole physical constitution. Every organ and cell thereby is attuned, so to speak, and subjected to an enormous and abnormal tension. The mind is ever on the plane of, and quite immersed in, that deceptive light whose soul is divine, but whose body, the light waves on the lower planes, infernal. For they are but the black and disfigured reflections of the earth's memories. The untrained eye of the poor sensitive cannot pierce the dark mist, the dense fog of the terrestrial emanations, to see beyond in the radiant field of the eternal truths. His vision is out of focus. His senses, accustomed from his birth, like those of a native of the London slums, to stench and filth, to the unnatural distortions of sights and images tossed on the kaleidoscopic waves of the astral plane, are unable to discern the true from the false. And thus, the pale soulless corpses moving in the trackless fields of Kama Loka, appear to him the living images of the dear departed ones. The broken echoes of once human voices, passing through his mind, suggest to him well-coordinated phrases, which he repeats, in ignorance that their final form and polish were received in the innermost depths of his own brain factory. And hence the sight and the hearing of that which if seen in its true nature would have struck the medium's heart cold with horror, now fills him with a sense of beatitude and confidence. He really believes that the immeasurable vistas displayed before him are the real spiritual world, the abode of the blessed disembodied angels. We describe the broad main features and facts of mediumship, there being no room in such an article for exceptional cases. We maintain, having unfortunately passed at one period of life personally through such experiences, that on the whole, mediumship is most dangerous. And psychic experiences when accepted indiscriminately lead only to honestly deceiving others, because the medium is the first self-deceived victim. Moreover, a too close association with the old terrestrial serpent is infectious. The odic and magnetic currents of the astral light often incite to murder, drunkenness, immorality, and, as Eliphaz Levi expresses it, the not altogether pure natures can be driven headlong by the blind forces set in motion in the light, by the errors and sins imposed on its waves. And this is how the great mage of the XXth century corroborates the foregoing when speaking of the astral light. We have said that to acquire magical power, two things are necessary: to disengage the will from all servitude, and to exercise it in control. The sovereign will, of the adept, is represented in our symbols by the woman who crushes the serpent's head, and by the resplendent angel who represses the dragon, and holds him under his foot and spear. The great magical agent, the dual current of light, the living and astral fire of the earth, has been represented in the ancient theogonies by the serpent with the head of a bull, a ram, or a dog. It is the double serpent of the caduceus, it is the old serpent of Genesis, but it is also the brazen serpent of Moses entwined around the Tau, that is to say, the generative lingam. It is also the goat of the witch Sabbath, and the Baphomet of the Templars, it is the Hyle of the Gnostics, it is the double-tailed serpent which forms the legs of the solar cock of Diabraxas, finally, it is the devil of M. Yudes de Mirville. But in very fact it is the blind force which souls, i.e., the lower manas or nephesh, have to conquer to liberate themselves from the bonds of the earth. For if their will does not free them from this fatal attraction, they will be absorbed in the current by the force which has produced them, and will return to the central and eternal fire. 26. The central and eternal fire is that disintegrating force that gradually consumes and burns out the Kamarupa, or personality, in the Kamaloka, whither it goes after death. And verily, the mediums are attracted by the astral light, it is the direct cause of their personal souls being absorbed by the force which has produced their terrestrial elements. And, therefore, as the same occultist tells us, all the magical operations consist in freeing oneself from the coils of the ancient serpent, then to place the foot on its head, and lead it according to the operator's will. I will give unto thee, says the serpent, in the gospel myth, all the kingdoms of the earth, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. The initiated should reply to him,